This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Czech Chris, London, UK. The Triumphs of Eugene Valmont, by Robert Barr. Chapter 6. The Ghost with the Club Foot. Celebrated critics have written with scorn of what they call the long arm of coincidence in fiction. Coincidence is supposed to be the device of a novelist who does not possess ingenuity enough to construct a book without it. In France, our incomparable writers pay no attention to this, because they are gifted with a keener insight into real life than is the case with the British. The superb Charles Dickens, possibly as well known in France as he is wherever the English language is read, and who loved French soil and the French people, probably probed deeper into the intricacies of human character than any other novelist of modern times, and if you read his works, you will see that he continually makes use of coincidence. The experience that has come to me throughout my own strange and varied career convinces me that coincidence happens in real life with exceeding frequency, and this fact is especially borne in upon me when I set out to relate my conflict with the Rantremly ghost, which wrought startling changes upon the lives of two people, one an objectionable, domineering man, and the other a humble and crushed woman. Of course, there was a third person, and the consequences that came to him were the most striking of all, as you will learn if you do me the honour to read this account of the episode. So far as coincidence is concerned, there was first the arrival of the newspaper clipping, then the coming of Sophia Brooks, and when that much injured woman left my flat, I wrote down this sentence on a sheet of paper: "Before the week is out, I predict that Lord Rantremly himself will call to see me." Next day, my servant brought in the card of Lord Rantremly. I must begin with the visit of Sophia Brooks, for though that comes second, yet I had paid no attention in particular to the newspaper clipping until the lady told her story. My man brought me a typewritten sheet of paper, on which were inscribed the words, "Sophia Brooks, Typewriting and Translating Office, First Floor, Number 51, Beaumont Street, Strand, London, W.C." I said to my servant, "Tell the lady as kindly as possible that I have no typewriting work to give out, and that, in fact, I keep a stenographer and typewriting machine on the premises." A few moments later my man returned, and said the lady wished to see me not about typewriting, but regarding a case in which she hoped to interest me. I was still in some hesitation about admitting her, for my transactions had now risen to a higher plane than when I was new to London. My expenses were naturally very heavy, and it was not possible for me, in justice to myself, to waste time in commissions from the poor, which, even if they resulted successfully, meant little money added to my banking account, and often nothing at all because the client was unable to pay. As I remarked before, I possess a heart the most tender, and therefore must greatly to my grief steel myself against the enlisting of my sympathy, which, alas, has frequently led to my financial loss. Still, sometimes the apparently poor are involved in matters of extreme importance, and England is so eccentric a country that one may find himself at fault if he closes the door too harshly. Indeed, ever since my servant, in the utmost good faith, threw downstairs the persistent and tattered beggar-man, who he learned later to his sorrow was actually His Grace the Duke of Ventnor, I have always cautioned my subordinates not to judge too hastily from appearances. "Show the lady in," I said, and there came to me, hesitating, backward, abashed, a middle-aged woman dressed with distressing plainness when one thinks of the charming costumes to be seen on a Parisian boulevard. Her subdued manner was that of one to whom the world had been cruel. I rose, bowed profoundly, and placed a chair at her disposal, with the air I should have used if my caller had been a royal princess. I claim no credit for this. It is of my nature. There you behold Eugene Valmont. My visitor was a woman. Voila. Madam, I said politely, in what may I have the pleasure of serving you? The poor woman seemed for the moment confused, and was, I feared, on the verge of tears, but at last she spoke, and said, "Perhaps you have read in the newspapers of the tragedy at Rantremly Castle?" "The name, madame, remains in my memory, associated elusively with some hint of seriousness. Will you pardon me a moment?" And a vague thought that I had seen the castle mentioned either in a newspaper or a clipping from one caused me to pick up the latest bunch, which had come from my agent. I am imbued with no vanity at all. Still, it is amusing to note what the newspapers say of one, and therefore I have subscribed to a clipping agency. In fact, I indulge in 2 subscriptions, one personal, the other calling for any pronouncement pertaining to the differences between England and France, for it is my determination yet to write a book on the comparative characteristics of the 2 people. I hold a theory that the English people are utterly incomprehensible to the rest of humanity, and this will be duly set out in my forthcoming volume. I speedily found the clipping I was in search of. It proved to be a letter to the Times, and was headed, "Proposed Destruction of Rantremly Castle." The letter went on to say that this edifice was one of the most noted examples of Norman architecture in the north of England, that Charles II had hidden there for some days after his disastrous defeat at Worcester. Part of the castle had been battered down by Cromwell, and later it again proved the refuge of a Stuart, when the Pretender made it a temporary place of concealment. The new Lord Rantremly, it seemed, had determined to demolish this ancient stronghold, so interesting architecturally and historically, and to build with its stones a modern residence. Against this act of vandalism the writer strongly protested, and suggested that England should acquire the power which France constantly exerts in making an historical monument of an edifice so interwoven with the fortunes of the country. "Well, madam," I said, "all this extract alludes to is the coming demolition of Rantremly Castle. Is that the tragedy of which you speak?" "Oh, no," she exclaimed. "I mean the death of the 11th Lord Rantremly about 6 weeks ago. For 10 years Lord Rantremly lived practically alone in the castle. Servants would not remain there because the place was haunted, and well it may be, for a terrible family the Rantremlys have been, and a cruel, as I shall be able to tell you. Up to a month and a half ago, Lord Rantremly was waited on by a butler older than himself, and, if possible, more wicked. One morning this old butler came up the stairs from the kitchen with Lord Rantremly's breakfast on a silver tray, as was his custom. His lordship always partook of breakfast in his own room. It is not known how the accident happened, as the old servant was going up the stairs instead of coming down, but the steps are very smooth and slippery and without a carpet. At any rate, he seems to have fallen from the top to the bottom, and lay there with a broken neck. Lord Rantremly, who was very deaf, seemingly did not hear the crash, and it is supposed that after ringing and ringing in vain, and doubtless working himself into a violent fit of temper, alas, too frequent an occurrence, the old nobleman got out of bed and walked barefooted down the stair, coming at last upon the body of his ancient servant. There the man who arrived every morning to light the fires found them, the servant dead, and Lord Rantremly helpless from an attack of paralysis. The physicians say that only his eyes seemed alive, and they were filled with a great fear, and indeed that is not to be wondered at after his wicked, wicked life. His right hand was but partially disabled, and with that he tried to scribble something which proved indecipherable. And so he died, and those who attended him at his last moments say that if ever a soul had a taste of future punishment before it left this earth, it was the soul of Lord Rantremly, as it shone through those terror-stricken eyes. Here the woman stopped, with a catch in her breath, as if the fear of that grim deathbed had communicated itself to her. I interjected calmness into an emotional situation by remarking, in a commonplace tone, "And it is the present Lord Rantremly who proposes to destroy the castle, I suppose?" "Yes." "Is he the son of the late lord?" "No, he is a distant relative. The branch of the family to which he belongs has been engaged in commerce, and I believe its members are very wealthy." "Well, madam, no doubt this is all extremely interesting and rather gruesome. In what way are you concerned in these occurrences?" 10 years ago I replied to an advertisement, there being required one who knew shorthand, who possessed a typewriting machine, and a knowledge of French, to act as secretary to a nobleman. I was at that time 23 years old, and for 2 years had been trying to earn my living in London through the typing of manuscript. But I was making a hard struggle of it, so I applied for this position and got it. There are in the library of Rantremly Castle many documents relating to the Stuart exile in France. His lordship wished these documents sorted and catalogued, as well as copies taken of each. Many of the letters were in the French language, and these I was required to translate and type. It was a sombre place of residence, but the salary was good, and I saw before me work enough to keep me busy for years. Besides this, the task was extremely congenial, and I became absorbed in it, being young and romantically inclined. Here I seemed to live in the midst of these wonderful intrigues of long ago. Documents passed through my hands whose very possession at one period meant capital danger, bringing up even now visions of block, axe, and masked headsman. It seemed strange to me that so sinister a man as Lord Rantremly, who, I had heard, cared for nothing but drink and gambling, should have desired to promote this historical research, and indeed I soon found he felt nothing but contempt for it. However, he had undertaken it at the instance of his only son, then a young man of my own age, at Oxford University. Lord Rantremly at that time was 65 years old. His countenance was dark, harsh, and imperious, and his language brutal. He indulged in frightful outbursts of temper, but he paid so well for service that there was no lack of it, as there has been since the ghost appeared some years ago. He was very tall, and of commanding appearance, but had a deformity in the shape of a club foot, and walked with the halting step of those so afflicted. There were at that time servants in plenty at the castle, for although a tradition existed that the ghost of the founder of the house trod certain rooms, this ghost, it was said, never demonstrated its presence when the living representative of the family was a man with a club foot. Tradition further affirmed that if this club-footed ghost allowed its halting footsteps to be heard while the reigning lord possessed a similar deformity, the conjunction foreshadowed the passing of title and estates to a stranger. The ghost haunted the castle only when it was occupied by a descendant whose 2 feet were normal. It seems that the founder of the house was a club-footed man, and this disagreeable peculiarity often missed one generation, and sometimes 2, while at other times both father and son had club feet, as was the case with the late Lord Rantremly and the young man at Oxford. I am not a believer in the supernatural, of course, but nevertheless it is strange that within the past few years everyone residing in the castle has heard the club-footed ghost, and now title and estates descend to a family that were utter strangers to the Rantremlys. Well, madam, this also sounds most alluring, and were my time not taken up with affairs more material than those to which you allude, I should be content to listen all day, but as it is—" I spread my hands and shrugged my shoulders. The woman, with a deep sigh, said, "I am sorry to have taken so long, but I wished you to understand the situation, and now I will come direct to the heart of the case. I worked alone in the library, as I told you, much interested in what I was doing. The chaplain, a great friend of Lord Rantremly's son, and indeed a former tutor of his, assisted me with the documents that were in Latin, and a friendship sprang up between us. He was an elderly man, and extremely unworldly. Lord Rantremly never concealed his scorn of this clergyman, but did not interfere with him because of the son. My work went on very pleasantly up to the time that Reginald, the heir of his lordship, came down from Oxford. Then began the happiest days of a life that has been otherwise full of hardships and distress. Reginald was as different as possible from his father. In one respect only did he bear any resemblance to that terrible old man, and this resemblance was the deformity of a club foot, a blemish which one soon forgot when one came to know the gentle and high-minded nature of the young man. As I have said, it was at his instance that Lord Rantremly had engaged me to set in order those historical papers. Reginald became enthusiastic at the progress I had made, and thus the young nobleman, the chaplain, and myself continued our work together with ever-increasing enthusiasm. To cut short a recital which must be trying to your patience, but which is necessary if you are to understand the situation, I may say that our companionship resulted in a proposal of marriage to me, which I, foolishly perhaps, and selfishly it may be, accepted. Reginald knew that his father would never consent, but we enlisted the sympathy of the chaplain, and he, mild, unworldly man, married us one day in the consecrated chapel of the castle. As I have told you, the house at that time contained many servants, and I think, without being sure, that the butler, whom I feared even more than Lord Rantremly himself, got some inkling of what was going forward. But, be that as it may, he and his lordship entered the chapel just as the ceremony was finished, and there followed an agonizing scene. His lordship flung the ancient chaplain from his place, and when Reginald attempted to interfere, the maddened nobleman struck his son full in the face with his clenched fist, and my husband lay as one dead on the stone floor of the chapel. By this time the butler had locked the doors, and had rudely torn the vestments from the aged, half-insensible clergyman, and with these tied him hand and foot. All this took place in a very few moments, and I stood there as one paralysed, unable either to speak or scream. Not that screaming would have done me any good in that horrible place of thick walls. The butler produced a key, and unlocked a small private door at the side of the chapel, which led from the apartments of his lordship to the family pew. Then, taking my husband by feet and shoulders, Lord Rantremly and the butler carried him out, locking the door, and leaving the clergyman and me prisoners in the chapel. The reverend old gentleman took no notice of me. He seemed to be dazed, and when at last I found my voice and addressed him, he merely murmured over and over texts of Scripture pertaining to the marriage service. In a short time I heard the key turn again in the lock of the private door, and the butler entered alone. He unloosened the bands around the clergyman's knees, escorted him out, and once more locked the door behind him. A third time that terrible servant came back, grasped me roughly by the wrist, and without a word dragged me with him along a narrow passage, up a stair, and finally to the main hall, and so to my lord's private study, which adjoined his bedroom, and there on a table I found my typewriting machine, brought up from the library. I have but the most confused recollection of what took place. I am not a courageous woman, and was in mortal terror both of Lord Rantremly and his attendant. His lordship was pacing up and down the room, and when I came in, used the most unseemly language to me, then ordered me to write at his dictation, swearing that if I did not do exactly as he told me, he would finish his son, as he put it. I sat down at the machine, and he dictated a letter to himself, demanding £2,000 to be paid to me, otherwise I should claim that I was the wife of his son secretly married. This, placing pen and ink before me, he compelled me to sign, and when I had done so, pleading to be allowed to see my husband, if only for a moment, I thought he was going to strike me, for he shook his fist in my face and used words which were appalling to hear. That was the last I ever saw of Lord Rantremly, my husband, the clergyman, or the butler. I was at once sent off to London with my belongings, the butler himself buying my ticket and flinging a handful of sovereigns into my lap as the train moved out. Here the woman stopped, buried her face in her hands, and began to weep. "Have you done nothing about this for the past 10 years?" She shook her head. "What could I do?" she gasped. "I had little money and no friends. Who would believe my story? Besides this, Lord Rantremly retained possession of a letter signed by myself that would convict me of attempted blackmail, while the butler would swear to anything against me." "You have no marriage certificate, of course?" "No." "What has become of the clergyman?" "I do not know." "And what of Lord Rantremly's son?" "It was announced that he had gone on a voyage to Australia for his health in a sailing ship, which was wrecked on the African coast, and everyone on board lost." "What is your own theory?" "Oh, my husband was killed by the blow given him in the chapel." "Madam, that does not seem credible. A blow from the fist seldom kills. But he fell backwards, and his head struck the sharp stone steps at the foot of the altar. I know my husband was dead when the butler and his father carried him out." "You think the clergyman was also murdered?" "I am sure of it. Both master and servant were capable of any crime or cruelty." "You received no letters from the young man?" "No. You see, during our short friendship we were constantly together, and there was no need of correspondence." "Well, madam, what do you expect of me?" "I hoped you would investigate, and find perhaps where Reginald and the clergyman are buried. I realise that I have no proof, but in that way my strange story will be corroborated." I leaned back in my chair and looked at her. Truth to tell, I only partially credited her story myself, and yet I was positive she believed every word of it. 10 years brooding on a fancied injustice by a woman living alone, and doubtless often in dire poverty, had mixed together the actual and the imaginary, until now, what had possibly been an aimless flirtation on the part of the young man, unexpectedly discovered by the father, had formed itself into the tragedy which she had told me. "Would it not be well," I suggested, "to lay the facts before the present Lord Rantremly?" "I have done so," she answered simply. "With what result?" "His lordship said my story was preposterous. In examining the late lord's private papers, he discovered the letter which I typed and signed. He said very coldly that the fact that I had waited until everyone who could corroborate or deny my story was dead, united with the improbability of the narrative itself, would very likely consign me to prison if I made public a statement so incredible." "Well, you know, madam, I think his lordship is right." "He offered me an annuity of £50, which I refused." "In that refusal, madam, I think you are wrong. If you take my advice, you will accept the annuity." The woman rose slowly to her feet. "It is not money I am after," she said, "although, God knows, I have often been in sore need of it. But I am the Countess of Rantremly, and I wish my right to that name acknowledged. My character has been under an impalpable shadow for 10 years. On several occasions mysterious hints have reached me that in some manner I left the castle under a cloud. If Lord Rantremly will destroy the letter which I was compelled to write under duress, and if he will give me written acknowledgment that there was nothing to be alleged against me during my stay in the castle, he may enjoy his money in peace for all of me. I want none of it." "Have you asked him to do this?" "Yes, he refuses to give up or destroy the letter, although I told him in what circumstances it had been written. But desiring to be fair, he said he would allow me £1 a week for life, entirely through his own generosity." "And this you refused?" "Yes, I refused." "Madam, I regret to say that I cannot see my way to do anything with regard to what I admit is very unjust usage. We have absolutely nothing to go upon except your unsupported word. Lord Rantremly was perfectly right when he said no one would credit your story. I could not go down to Rantremly Castle and make investigations there. I should have no right upon the premises at all, and would get into instant trouble as an interfering trespasser. I beg you to heed my advice and accept the annuity." Sophia Brooks, with that mild obstinacy of which I had received indications during her recital, slowly shook her head. "You have been very kind to listen for so long," she said, and then, with a curt "Good day," turned and left the room. On the sheet of paper underneath her address I wrote this prophecy: "Before the week is out, I predict that Lord Rantremly himself will call to see me." Next morning, at almost the same hour that Miss Brooks had arrived the day before, the Earl of Rantremly's card was brought in to me. His lordship proved to be an abrupt, ill-mannered, dapper businessman. Purse-proud, I should call him, as there was every reason he should be, for he had earned his own fortune. He was doubtless equally proud of his new title, which he was trying to live up to, assuming now and then a haughty, domineering attitude, and again relapsing into the keen, incisive manner of the man of affairs, shrewd financial sense waging a constant struggle with the glamour of an ancient name. I am sure he would have shone to better advantage either as a financier or as a nobleman, but the combination was too much for him. I formed an instinctive dislike to the man, which probably would not have happened had he been wearing the title for 20 years, or had I met him as a businessman with no thought of the aristocratic honour awaiting him. There seemed nothing in common between him and the former holder of the title. He had keen, ferrety eyes, a sharp financial nose, a thin-lipped line of mouth which indicated little of human kindness. He was short of stature, but he did not possess the club foot, which was one advantage. He seated himself before I had time to offer him a chair, and kept on his hat in my presence, which he would not have done if he had either been a genuine nobleman or a courteous businessman. "I am Lord Rantremly," he announced pompously, which announcement was quite unnecessary, because I held his card in my hand. "Quite so, my lord. And you have come to learn whether or no I can lay the ghost in that old castle to the north which bears your name." "Well, I'm blessed!" cried his lordship, agape. "How could you guess that?" "Oh, it is not a guess, but rather a choice of two objects, either of which might bring you to my rooms. I chose the first motive because I thought you might prefer to arrange the second problem with your solicitor, and he doubtless told you that Miss Sophia Brooks's claim was absurd, and that you were quite right in refusing to give up or destroy the typewritten letter she had signed 10 years ago, and that it was weakness on your part, without consulting him, to offer her an annuity of £52 a year. Long before this harangue was finished, which I uttered in an easy and nonchalant tone of voice, as if reciting something that everybody knew, his lordship stood on his feet again, staring at me like a man thunderstruck. This gave me the opportunity of exercising that politeness which his abrupt entrance and demeanour had forestalled. I rose, and bowing, said, "I pray you to be seated, my lord." He dropped into the chair rather than sat down in it. "And now," I continued with the utmost suavity, stretching forth my hand, "may I place your hat on this shelf out of the way, where it will not incommode you during our discourse?" Like a man in a dream, he took his hat from his head and passively handed it to me, and after placing it in safety, I resumed my chair with the comfortable feeling that his lordship and I were much nearer a plane of equality than when he entered the room. "Now, about the ghost with the club-foot, my lord," said I genially. "May I take it that in the city, that sensible commercial portion of London, no spirits are believed in except those sold over the bars?" "If you mean," began his lordship, struggling to reach his dignity once more, "if you mean to ask if there is any man fool enough to place credit in the story of a ghost, I answer no. I am a practical man, sir. I now possess in the north property representing in farming lands, in shooting rights, and what not, a locked-up capital of many £1,000. As you seem to know everything, sir, perhaps you are aware that I propose to build a modern mansion on the estate." "Yes, I saw the letter in the Times." "Very well, sir. It has come to a fine pass if, in this country of law and the rights of property, a man may not do what he pleases with his own." "I think, my lord, cases may be cited where the decisions of your courts have shown a man may not do what he likes with his own. Nevertheless, I am quite certain that if you level Rantremly Castle with the ground, and build a modern mansion in its place, the law will not hinder you." "I should hope not, sir, I should hope not," said his lordship gruffly. "Nevertheless, I am not one who wishes to ride roughshod over public opinion. I am chairman of several companies which depend more or less on popular favour for success. I deplore unnecessary antagonism. Technically, I might assert my right to destroy this ancient stronghold tomorrow if I wished to do so, and if that right were seriously disputed, I should, of course, stand firm. But it is not seriously disputed. The British nation, sir, is too sensible a people to object to the removal of an antiquated structure that has long outlived its usefulness, and the erection of a mansion replete with all modern improvements would be a distinct addition to the country, sir. A few impertinent busybodies protest against the demolition of Rantremly Castle, but that is all." "Ah, then you do intend to destroy it," I rejoined, and it is possible that a touch of regret was manifest in my tones. "Not just at present, not until this vulgar clamour has had time to subside. Nevertheless, as a business man, I am forced to recognise that a large amount of unproductive capital is locked up in that property." "And why is it locked up?" "Because of an absurd belief that the place is haunted. I could let it tomorrow at a good figure, if it were not for that rumour." "But surely sensible men do not pay any attention to such a rumour?" "Sensible men may not, but sensible men are often married to silly women, and the women object. It is only the other day that I was in negotiation with Bates, of Bates, Sturgeon and Bates, a very wealthy man, quite able and willing to pay the price I demanded. He cared nothing about the alleged ghost, but his family absolutely refused to have anything to do with the place, and so the arrangement fell through." "What is your theory regarding this ghost, my lord?" He answered me with some impatience. "How can a sane man hold a theory about a ghost? I can, however, advance a theory regarding the noises heard in the castle. For years that place has been the resort of questionable characters." "I understand the Rantremly family is a very old one," I commented innocently, but his lordship did not notice the innuendo. "Yes, we are an old family," he went on with great complacency. "The castle, as perhaps you are aware, is a huge ramshackle place, honeycombed underneath with cellars. I dare say in the old days some of these cellars and caves were the resort of smugglers, and the receptacle of their contraband wares, doubtless with the full knowledge of my ancestors, who, I regret to admit as a businessman, were not too particular in their respect for law. I make no doubt that the castle is now the refuge of a number of dangerous characters, who, knowing the legends of the place, frighten away fools by impersonating ghosts." "You wish me to uncover their retreat, then?" "Precisely." "Could I get accommodation in the castle itself?" "Lord bless you, no, nor within 2 miles of it. You might secure bed and board at the porter's lodge, perhaps, or in the village, which is 3 miles distant." "I should prefer to live in the castle night and day, until the mystery is solved." "Ah, you are a practical man. That is a very sensible resolution, but you can persuade no one in that neighbourhood to bear you company. You would need to take some person down with you from London, and the chances are that person will not stay long. Perhaps, my lord, if you used your influence, the chief of police in the village might allow a constable to bear me company. I do not mind roughing it in the least, but I should like someone to prepare my meals, and to be on hand in case of a struggle, should your surmise concerning the ghost prove correct. I regret to inform you, said his lordship, that the police in that barbarous district are as superstitious as the peasantry. I myself told the chief constable my theory, and for 6 weeks he has been trying to run down the miscreants, who I am sure are making a rendezvous of the castle. Would you believe it, sir, that the constabulary, after a few nights' experience in the castle, threatened to resign in a body if they were placed on duty at Rantremly? They said they heard groans and shrieks, and the measured beat of a club foot on the oaken floors. Perfectly absurd, of course, but there you are. Why, I cannot even get a charwoman or labourer to clear up the evidences of the tragedy which took place there 6 weeks ago. The beds are untouched, the broken china and the silver tray lie today at the foot of the stairway, and everything remains just as it was when the inquest took place. Very well, my lord. The case presents many difficulties, and so, speaking as one businessman to another, you will understand that my compensation must be correspondingly great. All the assumed dignity which straightened up this man whenever I addressed him as my lord instantly fell from him when I enunciated the word compensation. His eyes narrowed, and all the native shrewdness of an adept skinflint appeared in his face. I shall do him the justice to say that he drove the very best bargain he could with me, and I, on my part, very deftly concealed from him the fact that I was so much interested in the affair that I should have gone down to Rantremly for nothing rather than forego the privilege of ransacking Rantremly Castle. When the new earl had taken his departure, walking to the door with the haughty air of a nobleman, then bowing to me with the affability of a businessman, I left my flat, took a cab, and speedily found myself climbing the stair to the first floor of 51 Beaumont Street, Strand. As I paused at the door, on which were painted the words S. Brooks, Stenography, Typewriting, Translation, I heard the rapid click-click of a machine inside. Knocking at the door, the writing ceased, and I was bidden to enter. The room was but meagrely furnished, and showed scant signs of prosperity. On a small side table, clean but uncovered, the breakfast dishes, washed but not yet put away, stood, and the kettle on the hob by the dying fire led me to infer that the typewriting woman was her own cook. I suspected that the awkward-looking sofa, which partly occupied one side of the room, concealed a bed. By the lone front window stood the typewriting machine on a small stand, and in front of it sat the woman who had visited me the morning before. She was now gazing at me, probably hoping I was a customer, for there was no recognition in her eyes. "Good morning, Lady Rantremly," was my greeting, which caused her to spring immediately to her feet with a little exclamation of surprise. "Oh," she said at last, "you are Monsieur Valmont. Excuse me that I am so stupid. Will you take a chair?" "Thank you, madam." "It is I who should ask to be excused for so unceremonious a morning call. I have come to ask you a question. Can you cook?" The lady looked at me with some surprise, mingled perhaps with so much of indignation as such a mild person could assume. She did not reply, but, glancing at the kettle, and then turning towards the breakfast dishes on the table by the wall, a slow flush of colour suffused her wan cheeks. "My lady," I said at last, as the silence became embarrassing, "you must pardon the impulse of a foreigner who finds himself constantly brought into conflict with prejudices which he fails to understand. You are perhaps offended at my question. The last person of whom I made that inquiry was the young and beautiful Madame la Comtesse de Valerie Montmorin, who enthusiastically clapped her hands with delight at the compliment, and replied impulsively, 'Oh, Monsieur Valmont, let me compose for you an omelette which will prove a dream.' And she did. One should not forget that Louis XVIII himself cooked the truffes à la purée de Tolan that caused the Duc de Scar, who partook of the royal dish, to die of an indigestion. Cooking is a noble, yes, a regal art. I am a Frenchman, my lady, and, like all my countrymen, regard the occupation of a cuisinière as infinitely superior to the manipulation of that machine which is your profession, or the science of investigation which is mine. Sir, she said, quite unmollified by my harangue, speaking with a lofty pride which somehow seemed much more natural than that so intermittently assumed by my recent visitor, Sir, have you come to offer me a situation as cook? Yes, madam, at Rantremly Castle. You are going there? She demanded, almost breathlessly. Yes, madam. I leave on the 10 o'clock train tomorrow morning. I am commissioned by Lord Rantremly to investigate the supposed presence of the ghost in that mouldering dwelling. I am allowed to bring with me whatever assistance I require, and am assured that no one in the neighbourhood can be retained who dare sleep in the castle. You know the place very well, having lived there, so I shall be glad of your assistance if you will come. If there is any person whom you can trust, and who is not afraid of ghosts, I shall be delighted to escort you both to Rantremly Castle tomorrow. There is an old woman, she said, who comes here to clear up my room and do whatever I wish done. She is so deaf that she will hear no ghosts, and besides, monsieur, she can cook. I laughed in acknowledgment of this last sly hit at me, as the English say. That will do excellently, I replied, rising and placing a £10 note before her. I suggest, madam, that you purchase with this anything you may need. My man has instructions to send by passenger train a huge case of provisions, which should arrive there before us. If you could make it convenient to meet me at Euston Station about a quarter of an hour before the train leaves, we may be able to discover all you wish to know regarding the mystery of Rantremly Castle. Sophia Brooks accepted the money without demur, and thanked me. I could see that her thin hands were trembling with excitement as she put the crackling bank-note into her purse. Darkness was coming on next evening before we were installed in the grim building, which at first sight seemed more like a fortress than a residence. I had telegraphed from London to order a wagonette for us, and in this vehicle we drove to the police station, where I presented the written order from Lord Rantremly for the keys of the castle. The chief constable himself, a stolid, taciturn person, exhibited nevertheless some interest in my mission, and he was good enough to take the fourth seat in the wagonette and accompany us through the park to the castle, returning in that conveyance to the village as nightfall approached, and I could not but notice that this grave official betrayed some uneasiness to get off before dusk had completely set in. Silent as he was, I soon learned that he entirely disbelieved Lord Rantremly's theory that the castle harboured dangerous characters, yet so great was his inherent respect for the nobility that I could not induce him to dispute with any decisiveness his lordship's conjecture. It was plain to be seen, however, that the chief constable believed implicitly in the club-footed ghost. I asked him to return the next morning, as I should spend the night in investigation, and might possibly have some questions to ask him, questions which none but the chief constable could answer. The good man promised, and left us rather hurriedly, the driver of the wagonette galloping his horse down the long sombre avenue towards the village outside the gates. I found Sophia Brooks but a doleful companion, and of very little assistance that evening. She seemed overcome by her remembrances. She had visited the library where her former work was done, doubtless the scene of her brief love episode, and she returned with red eyes and trembling chin, telling me haltingly that the great tome from which she was working 10 years ago, and which had been left open on the solid library table, was still there exactly as she had placed it before being forced to abandon her work. For a decade, apparently, no one had entered that library. I could not but sympathise with the poor lady, thus revisiting, almost herself like a ghost, the haunted arena of her short happiness. But though she proved so dismal a companion, The old woman who came with her was a treasure. Having lived all her life in some semi-slum near the Strand, and having rarely experienced more than a summer's day glimpse of the country, the long journey had delighted her, and now this rambling old castle in the midst of the forest seemed to realise all the dreams which a perusal of halfpenny fiction had engendered in her imagination. She lit a fire, and cooked for us a very creditable supper, bustling about the place, singing to herself in a high key. Shortly after supper, Sophia Brooks, exhausted as much by her emotions and memories as by her long journey of that day, retired to rest. After being left to myself, I smoked some cigarettes, and finished a bottle of superb claret which stood at my elbow. A few hours before I had undoubtedly fallen in the estimation of the stolid constable, when, instead of asking him questions regarding the tragedy, I had inquired the position of the wine cellar, and obtained possession of the key that opened its portal. The sight of bin after bin of dust-laden, cobwebbed bottles did more than anything else to reconcile me to my lonely vigil. There were some notable vintages represented in that dismal cavern. It was perhaps 10:30 or 11 o'clock when I began my investigations. I had taken the precaution to provide myself with 6 so-called electric torches before I left London. These give illumination for 20 or 30 hours steadily, and much longer if the flash is used only now and then. The torch is a thick tube, perhaps 1.5 feet long, with a bull's eye of glass at one end. By pressing a spring, the electric rays project like the illumination of an engine's headlight. A release of the spring causes instant darkness. I have found this invention useful in that it concentrates the light on any particular spot desired, leaving all the surroundings in gloom, so that the mind is not distracted even unconsciously by the eye beholding more than is necessary at the moment. One pours a white light over any particular substance, as water is poured from the nozzle of a hose. The great house was almost painfully silent. I took one of these torches and went to the foot of the grand staircase where the wicked butler had met his death. There, as his lordship had said, lay the silver tray, and near by a silver jug, a pair of spoons, a knife and fork, and scattered all around the fragments of broken plates, cups, and saucers. With an exclamation of surprise at the stupidity of the researchers who had preceded me, I ran up the stair 2 steps at a time, turned to the right and along the corridor, until I came to the room occupied by the late Earl. The coverings of the bed lay turned down just as they were when his lordship sprang to the floor, doubtless in spite of his deafness, having heard faintly the fatal crash at the foot of the stairs. A great oaken chest stood at the head of the bed, perhaps 6 inches from the wall. Leaning against this chest at the edge of the bed inclined a small round table, and the cover of the table had slipped from its sloping surface until it partially concealed the chest lid. I mounted on this carven box of old black oak, and directed the rays of electric light into the chasm between it and the wall. Then I laughed aloud, and was somewhat startled to hear another laugh directly behind me. I jumped down on the floor again, and swung round my torch like a searchlight on a battleship at sea. There was no human presence in that chamber except myself. Of course, after my first moment of surprise, I realised that the laugh was but an echo of my own. The old walls of the old house were like sounding boards. The place resembled an ancient fiddle, still tremulous with the music that had been played on it. It was easy to understand how a superstitious population came to believe in its being haunted. In fact, I found by experiment that if one trod quickly along the uncovered floor of the corridor and stopped suddenly, one seemed to hear the sound of steps still going on. I now returned to the stair-head, and examined the bare polished boards with most gratifying results. Amazed at having learnt so much in such a short time, I took from my pocket the paper on which the dying nobleman had attempted to write with his half-paralysed hand. The chief constable had given the document to me, and I sat on the stair-head, spread it out on the floor, and scrutinised it. It was all but meaningless. Apparently 2 words, and the initial letter of a third had been attempted. Now, however grotesque a piece of writing may be, you can sometimes decipher it by holding it at various angles, as those puzzles are solved, which remain a mystery when gazed at direct. By partially closing the eyes, you frequently catch the intent, as in those pictures where a human figure is concealed among the outlines of trees and leaves. I held the paper at arm's length, and with the electric light gleaming upon it, examined it at all angles, with eyes wide open and eyes half closed. At last, inclining it away from me, I saw that the words were intended to mean "the secret." The secret, of course, was what he was trying to impart, but he had evidently got no further than the title of it. Deeply absorbed in my investigation, I was never more startled in my life than to hear in the stillness down the corridor the gasped words, "Oh, God!" I swept round my light, and leaning against the wall in an almost fainting condition, Sophia Brooks, her eyes staring like those of a demented person, and her face white as any ghost's could have been. Wrapped round her was a dressing-gown. I sprang to my feet. "What are you doing there?" I cried. "Oh, is that you, Monsieur Valmont? Thank God, thank God. I thought I was going insane. I saw a hand, a bodiless hand, holding a white sheet of paper." "The hand was far from bodiless, madame, for it belonged to me. But why are you here? It must be near midnight." "It is midnight," answered the woman. "I came here because I heard my husband call me 3 times distinctly. Sophia, 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 just like that." "Nonsense, madam," I said, with an asperity I seldom use where the fair sex is concerned. But I began to see that this hysterical creature was going to be in the way during a research that called for coolness and calmness. I was sorry I had invited her to come. "Nonsense, madam, you have been dreaming." "Indeed, Monsieur Valmont, I have not. I have not even been asleep, and I heard the words quite plainly. You must not think I am either mad or superstitious." I thought she was both, and next moment she gave further evidence of it, running suddenly forward and clutching me by the arm. "Listen, listen," she whispered. "You hear nothing?" "Nonsense," I cried again, almost roughly, for my patience was at an end, and I wished to go on with my inquiry undisturbed. "Hist, hist," she whispered. "Listen," holding up her finger. We both stood like statues, and suddenly I felt that curious creeping of the scalp which shows that even the most civilized among us have not yet eliminated superstitious fear. In the tense silence I heard someone slowly coming up the stair. I heard the halting step of a lame man. In the tension of the moment I had allowed the light to go out. Now, recovering myself, I pressed the spring and waved its rays backward and forward down the stairway. The space was entirely empty, yet the hesitating footsteps approached us, up and up. I could almost have sworn on which step they last struck. At this interesting moment, Sophia Brooks uttered a piercing shriek and collapsed into my arms, sending the electric torch rattling down the steps and leaving us in impenetrable darkness. Really, I profess myself to be a gallant man, but there are situations which have a tendency to cause annoyance. I carried the limp creature cautiously down the stairs, fearing the fate of the butler, and at last got her into the dining-room, where I lit a candle, which gave a light less brilliant, perhaps, but more steady than my torch. I dashed some water in her face, and brought her to her senses. Then, uncorking another bottle of wine, I bade her drink a glassful, which she did. "What was it?" she whispered. "Madam, I do not know. Very possibly the club-footed ghost of Rantremly." "Do you believe in ghosts, Monsieur Valmont?" "Last night I did not, but at this hour I believe in only one thing, which is that it is time everyone was asleep." She rose to her feet at this, and with a tremulous little laugh apologised for her terror, but I assured her that for the moment there were 2 panic-stricken persons at the stair-head. Taking the candle and recovering my electric torch, which luckily was uninjured by its roll down the incline the butler had taken, I escorted the lady to the door of her room and bade her good night, or rather good morning. The rising sun dissipated a slight veil of mist which hung over the park, and also dissolved, as far as I was concerned, the phantoms which my imagination had conjured up at midnight. It was about 10:30 when the chief constable arrived. I flatter myself I put some life into that unimaginative man before I was done with him. What made you think that the butler was mounting the stair when he fell? He was going up with my lord's breakfast, replied the chief. Then it did not occur to you that if such were the case, the silver pitcher would not have been empty, and besides the broken dishes there would have been the rolls, butter, toast, and what not, strewn about the floor? The chief constable opened his eyes. There was no one else for him to bring breakfast to, he objected. That is where you are very much mistaken. Bring me the boots the butler wore. He did not wear boots, sir. He wore a pair of cloth slippers. Do you know where they are? Yes, they're in the boot closet. Very well, bring them out. Examine their soles, and sticking in one of them you will find a short sliver of pointed oak. The constable, looking slightly more stupefied than ever, brought the slippers, and I heard him ejaculate, "Well, I'm blowed," as he approached me. He handed me the slippers, soles upward, and there, as I have stated, was the fragment of oak, which I pulled out. Now, if you take this piece of oak to the top of the stair, you will see that it fits exactly a slight interstice at the edge of one of the planks. It is as well to keep one's eyes open, constable, when investigating a case like this. Well, I'm blowed, he said again, as we walked up the stair together. I showed him that the sliver taken from the slipper fitted exactly the interstice I had indicated. Now, said I to him, the butler was not going up the stairs, but was coming down. When he fell headlong, he must have made a fearful clatter. Shuffling along with his burden, his slipper was impaled by this sliver, and the butler's hands being full, he could not save himself, but went head foremost down the stair. The startling point, however, is the fact that he was not carrying my lord's breakfast to him, or taking it away from him, but that there is someone else in the castle for whom he was caterer. Who is that person? I'm blessed if I know, said the constable, but I think you're wrong there. He may not have been carrying up the breakfast, but he was certainly taking away the tray, as is shown by the empty dishes, which you have just a moment ago pointed out. No, constable. When his lordship heard the crash and sprang impulsively from his bed, he upset the little table on which had been placed his own tray. It shot over the oaken chest at the head of the bed, and if you look between it and the wall, you will find tray, dishes, and the remnants of a breakfast. Well, I'm blessed, exclaimed the chief constable once again. The main point of all this, I went on calmly, is not the disaster to the butler, nor even the shock to his lordship, but the fact that the tray the serving man carried brought food to a prisoner, who probably for 6 weeks has been without anything to eat. Then, said the constable, he's a dead man. I find it easier, said I, to believe in a living man than in a dead man's ghost. I think I heard his footsteps at midnight, and they seemed to me the footsteps of a person very nearly exhausted. Therefore, constable, I have awaited your arrival with some impatience. The words his late lordship endeavoured to write on the paper were "the secret." I am sure that the hieroglyphics with which he ended his effort stood for the letter R, and if he finished his sentence it would have stood "the secret room." Now, constable, it is a matter of legend that a secret room exists in this castle. Do you know where it is? No one knows where the secret room is, or the way to enter it, except the lords of Rantremly. Well, I can assure you that the lord of Rantremly who lives in London knows nothing about it. I have been up and about since daylight, taking some rough measurements by stepping off distances. I surmise that the secret room is to the left of this stairway. Probably a whole suite of rooms exists, for there is certainly a stair coinciding with this one, and up that stair at midnight I heard a club-footed man ascend. Either that, or the ghost that has frightened you all, and, as I have said, I believe in the man." Here the official made the first sensible remark I had yet heard him utter. "If the walls are so thick that a prisoner's cry has not been heard, how could you hear his footsteps, which make much less noise?" "That is very well put, constable, and when the same thing occurred to me earlier this morning, I began to study the architecture of this castle. In the first place, the entrance hall is double as wide at the big doors as it is near the stairway. If you stand with your back to the front door, you will at once wonder why the builders made this curious and unnecessary right angle, narrowing the further part of the hall to half its width. Then, as you gaze at the stair, and see that marvellous carved oak newel post standing like a monumental column, you guess, if you have any imagination, that the stairway, like the hall, was once double as wide as it is now. We are seeing only half of it, and doubtless we shall find a similar newel post within the hidden room. You must remember, constable, that these secret apartments are no small added chambers. Twice they have sheltered a king." The constable's head bent low at the mention of royalty. I saw that his insular prejudice against me and my methods was vanishing, and that he had come to look upon me with greater respect than was shown at first. The walls need not be thick to be impenetrable to sound. 2 courses of brick, and a space between filled with deafening, would do it. The secret apartment has been cut off from the rest of the house since the castle was built, and was not designed by the original architect. The partition was probably built in a hurry to fulfil a pressing need, and it was constructed straight up the middle of the stair, leaving the stout planks intact, each step passing thus, as it were, through the wall. Now, when a man walks up the secret stairway, his footsteps reverberate until one would swear that some unseen person was treading the visible boards on the outside. "By Jove!" said the constable, in an awed tone of voice. "Now, officer, I have here a pickaxe and a crowbar. I propose that we settle the question at once." But to this proposal the constable demurred. "You surely would not break the wall without permission from his lordship in London?" Constable: "I suspect there is no Lord Rantremly in London, and that we will find a very emaciated but genuine Lord Rantremly within 10 feet of us. I need not tell you that if you are instrumental in his immediate rescue, without the exercise of too much red tape, your interests will not suffer because you the more speedily brought food and drink to the Lord Paramount of your district." "Right you are," cried the constable, with an enthusiasm for which I was not prepared. "Where shall we begin?" "Oh, anywhere. This wall is all false, from the entrance hall to some point up here. Still, as the butler was carrying the meal upstairs, I think we shall save time if we begin on the landing." I found the constable's brawn much superior to his brain. He worked like a sans-culotte on a barricade. When we had torn down part of the old oak panelling, which it seemed such a pity to mutilate with axe and crowbar, we came upon a brick wall, that quickly gave way before the strength of the constable. Then we pulled out some substance like matting, and found a second brick wall, beyond which was a further shell of panelling. The hole we made revealed nothing but darkness inside, and, although we shouted, there was no answer. At last, when we had hewn it large enough for a man to enter, I took with me an electric torch, and stepped inside, the constable following with crowbar still in hand. I learned, as I had surmised, that we were in the upper hall of a staircase nearly as wide as the one on the outside. A flash of the light showed a door corresponding with the fireplace of the upper landing, and this door not being locked, we entered a large room, rather dimly lighted by strongly barred windows that gave into a blind courtyard, of which there had been no indication heretofore, either outside or inside the castle. Broken glass crunched under our feet, and I saw that the floor was strewn with wine bottles, whose necks had been snapped off to save the pulling of the cork. On a mattress at the farther end of the room lay a man with grey hair and shaggy, unkempt, iron-grey beard. He seemed either asleep or dead. but when I turned my electric light full on his face, he proved to be still alive, for he rubbed his eyes languidly and groaned rather than spoke. "Is that you at last, you beast of a butler? Bring me something to eat, in heaven's name." I shook him wider awake. He seemed to be drowsed with drink, and was fearfully emaciated. When I got him on his feet, I noticed then the deformity that characterized one of them. We assisted him through the aperture and down into the dining-room, where he cried out continually for something to eat, but when we placed food before him he could scarcely touch it. He became more like a human being when he had drunk 2 glasses of wine, and I saw at once that he was not as old as his grey hair seemed to indicate. There was a haunted look in his eyes, and he watched the door as if apprehensive. "Where is that butler?" he asked at last. "Dead," I replied. "Did I kill him?" "No, he fell down the stairway and broke his neck." The man laughed harshly. "Where is my father?" "Who is your father?" "Lord Rantremly." "He is dead also." "How came he to die?" "He died from a stroke of paralysis on the morning the butler was killed." The rescued man made no comment on this, but turned and ate a little more of his food. Then he said to me, "Do you know a girl named Sophia Brooks?" "Yes. For 10 years she thought you dead." 10 years. Good God! Do you mean to say I've been in there only 10 years? Why, I'm an old man. I must be 60 at least." "No, you're not much over 30. Is Sophia—" He stopped, and the haunted look came into his eyes again. "No, she's all right, and she's here." "Here?" "Somewhere in the grounds. I sent her and the servant out for a walk, and told them not to return till luncheon time, as the constable and I had something to do, and did not wish to be interrupted." The man ran his hand through his long tangled beard. "I should like to be trimmed up a bit before I see Sophia," he said. "I can do that for you, my lord," cried the constable. "My lord?" echoed the man. "Oh yes, I understand. You are a policeman, are you not?" "Yes, my lord, chief constable." "Then I shall give myself up to you. I killed the butler." "Oh, impossible, my lord." "No, it isn't. The beast, as I called him, was getting old, and one morning he forgot to close the door behind him. I followed him stealthily out, and at the head of the stair planted my foot in the small of his back, which sent him headlong. There was an infernal crash. I did not mean to kill the brute, but merely to escape, and just as I was about to run down the stairway I was appalled to see my father looking like, well, I won't attempt to say what he looked like, but all my old fear of him returned. As he strode toward me along the corridor I was in such a terror that I jumped through the secret door and slammed it shut." "Where is the secret door?" I asked. "The secret door is that fireplace. The whole fireplace moves inward if you push aside the carved ornament at the left-hand corner." "Is it a dummy fireplace, then?" "No, you may build a fire in it, and the smoke will escape up the chimney. But I killed the butler, constable, though not intending it, I swear." And now the constable shone forth like the real rough diamond he was. "My lord will say nothing about that. Legally you didn't do it. You see, there's been an inquest on the butler, and the jury brought in the verdict, death by accident through stumbling from the top of the stair. You can't go behind a coroner's inquest, my lord." "Indeed," said his lordship, with the first laugh in which he had indulged for many a year, "I don't want to go behind anything, constable. I've been behind that accursed chimney too long to wish any further imprisonment." End of chapter 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris, London, UK. The Triumphs of Eugene Valmont, by Robert Barr. Chapter 7. The Liberation of Wyoming Ed. A man should present the whole truth to his doctor, his lawyer, or his detective. If a doctor is to cure, he must be given the full confidence of the patient. If a lawyer is to win a case, he needs to know what tells against his client, as well as the points in his favour. If a secret agent is to solve a mystery, all the cards should be put on the table. Those who half trust a professional man need not be disappointed when results prove unsatisfactory. A partial confidence reposed in me led to the liberation of a dangerous criminal, caused me to associate with a robber, much against my own inclination, and brought me within danger of the law. Of course, I never pretend to possess that absolute confidence in the law which seems to be the birthright of every Englishman. I have lived too intimately among the machinery of the law, and have seen too many of its ghastly mistakes, to hold it in that blind esteem which appears to be prevalent in the British Isles. There is a doggerel couplet which typifies this spirit better than anything I can write, and it runs, "No rogue e'er felt the halter draw with a good opinion of the law." Those lines exemplify the trend of British thought in this direction. If you question a verdict of their courts, you are a rogue, and that ends the matter. And yet, when an Englishman undertakes to circumvent the law, there is no other man on earth who will go to greater lengths. An amazing people, never understandable by the sane of other countries. It was entirely my own fault that I became involved in affairs which were almost indefensible and wholly illegal. My client first tried to bribe me into compliance with his wishes, which bribe I sternly refused. Then he partially broke down, and quite unconsciously, as I take it, made an appeal to the heart, a strange thing for an Englishman to do. My kind heart has ever been my most vulnerable point. We French are sentimentalists. France has before now staked its very existence for an ideal, while other countries fight for continents, cash, or commerce. You cannot pierce me with a lance of gold, but wave a wand of sympathy, and I am yours. There waited for me in my flat a man who gave his name as Douglas Sanderson, which may or may not have been his legitimate title. This was a question into which I never probed, and at the moment of writing am as ignorant of his true cognomen, if that was not it, as on the morning he first met me. He was an elderly man of natural dignity and sobriety, slow in speech, almost sombre in dress. His costume was not quite that of a professional man, and not quite that of a gentleman. I at once recognised the order to which he belonged, and a most difficult class it is to deal with. He was the confidential servant or steward of some ancient and probably noble family, embodying in himself all the faults and virtues, each a trifle accentuated, of the line he served, and to which, in order to produce him and his like, his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had doubtless been attached. It is frequently the case that the honour of the house he serves is more dear to him than it is to the representative of that house. Such a man is almost always the repository of family secrets, a repository whose inviolability gold cannot affect, threats sway, or cajolery influence. I knew when I looked at him that practically I was looking at his master, for I have known many cases where even the personal appearance of the two was almost identical, which may have given rise to the English phrase, like master, like man. The servant was a little more haughty, a little less kind, a little more exclusive, a little less confidential, a little more condescending, a little less human, a little more Tory, and altogether a little less pleasant and easy person to deal with. "Sir," he began, when I had waved him to a seat, "I am a very rich man, and can afford to pay well for the commission I request you to undertake. To ask you to name your own terms may seem unbusinesslike, so I may say at the outset I am not a business man. The service I shall ask will involve the utmost secrecy, and for that I am willing to pay. It may expose you to risk of limb or liberty, and for that I am willing to pay. It will probably necessitate the expenditure of a large sum of money. That sum is at your disposal." Here he paused. He had spoken slowly and impressively, with a touch of arrogance in his tone which aroused to his prejudice the combativeness latent in my nature. However, at this juncture I merely bowed my head, and replied, in accents almost as supercilious as his own, "The task must either be unworthy or unwelcome. In mentioning first the compensation, you are inverting the natural order of things. You should state at the outset what you expect me to do. Then, if I accept the commission, it is time to discuss the details of expenditure." Either he had not looked for such a reply, or was loath to open his budget, for he remained a few moments with eyes bent upon the floor and lips compressed in silence. At last he went on, without change of inflection, without any diminution of that air of condescension which had so exasperated me in the beginning, and which was preparing a downfall for himself that would rudely shake the cold dignity which encompassed him like a cloak. It is difficult for a father to confide in a complete stranger the vagaries of a beloved son, and before doing so you must pledge your word that my communication will be regarded as strictly confidential. Cela va sans dire. I do not understand French, said Mr. Sanderson severely, as if the use of the phrase were an insult to him. I replied nonchalantly, "It means, as a matter of course. That goes without saying. Whatever you care to tell me about your son will be mentioned to no one. Pray proceed without further circumlocution, for my time is valuable. My son was always a little wild and impatient of control. Although everything he could wish was at his disposal here at home, he chose to visit America, where he fell into bad company. I assure you there is no real harm in the boy, but he became implicated with others, and has suffered severely for his recklessness. For 5 years he has been an inmate of a prison in the West. He was known and convicted under the name of Wyoming Ed. What was his crime? His alleged crime was the stopping and robbing of a railway train. For how long was he sentenced? He was sentenced for life. What do you wish me to do? Every appeal has been made to the governor of the state in an endeavour to obtain a pardon. These appeals have failed. I am informed that if money enough is expended, it may be possible to arrange my son's escape. In other words, you wish me to bribe the officials of the jail? I assure you the lad is innocent." For the first time a quiver of human emotion came into the old man's voice. "Then, if you can prove that, why not apply for a new trial? Unfortunately, the circumstances of the case, of his arrest on the train itself, the number of witnesses against him, give me no hope that a new trial would end in a different verdict, even if a new trial could be obtained, which I am informed is not possible. Every legal means tending to his liberation has already been tried." "I see. And now you are determined to adopt illegal means. I refuse to have anything to do with the malpractice you propose. You objected to a phrase in French, Mr. Sanderson. Perhaps one in Latin will please you better. It is veritas prevalebit, which means truth will prevail. I shall set your mind entirely at rest regarding your son. Your son at this moment occupies a humble, if honourable, position in the great house from which you came, and he hopes in time worthily to fill his father's shoes, as you have filled the shoes of your father. You are not a rich man, but a servant. Your son never was in America, and never will go there. It is your master's son, the heir to great English estates, who became the Wyoming Ed of the Western prison. Even from what you say, I do not in the least doubt he was justly convicted, and you may go back to your master and tell him so. You came here to conceal the shameful secret of a wealthy and noble house. You may return knowing that secret has been revealed, and that the circumstances in which you so solemnly bound me to secrecy never existed. Sir, That is the penalty of lying.' The old man's contempt for me had been something to be felt, so palpable was it. The armour of icy reserve had been so complete that actually I had expected to see him rise with undiminished hauteur and leave the room, disdaining further parley with one who had insulted him. Doubtless that is the way in which his master would have acted, but even in the underling I was unprepared for the instantaneous crumbling of this monument of pomp and pride. A few moments after I began to speak in terms as severe as his own, his trembling hands grasped the arms of the chair in which he sat, and his ever-widening eyes, which came to regard me with something like superstitious dread as I went on, showed me I had launched my random arrow straight at the bull's-eye of fact. His face grew mottled and green rather than pale. When at last I accused him of lying, he arose slowly, shaking like a man with a palsy, but, unable to support himself erect, sank helplessly back into his chair again. His head fell forward to the table before him, and he sobbed aloud. "God help me," he cried. "It is not my own secret I am trying to guard." I sprang to the door, and turned the key in the lock, so that by no chance might we be interrupted. Then, going to the sideboard, I poured him out a liqueur glass full of the finest cognac ever imported from south of the Loire, and tapping him on the shoulder, said brusquely, "Here, drink this. The case is no worse than it was half an hour ago. I shall not betray the secret." He tossed off the brandy, and with some effort regained his self-control. "I have done my errand badly," he wailed. "I don't know what I have said that has led you to so accurate a statement of the real situation, but I have been a blundering fool. God forgive me, when so much depended on my making no mistake." "Don't let that trouble you," I replied. "Nothing you said gave me the slightest clue." "You called me a liar," he continued, "and that is a hard word from one man to another. But I would not lie for myself, and when I do it for one I revere and respect, my only regret is that I have done it without avail." "My dear sir," I assured him, "the fault is not with yourself at all. You were simply attempting the impossible. Stripped and bare, your proposal amounts to this. I am to betake myself to the United States, and there commit a crime, or a series of crimes, in bribing sworn officials to turn traitor to their duty and permit a convict to escape." "You put it very harshly, sir." "You must admit that, especially in new countries, there is lawlessness within the law as well as outside of it. The real criminals in the robbery of the railway train escaped. My young master, poor fellow, was caught. His father, one of the proudest men in England, has grown prematurely old under the burden of this terrible dishonour. He is broken-hearted and a dying man, yet he presents an impassive front to the world with all the ancient courage of his race. My young master is an only son, and failing his appearance, should his father die, title and estate will pass to strangers. Our helplessness in this situation adds to its horror. We dare not make any public move. My old master is one with such influence among the governing class of this country, of which he has long been a member, that the average Englishman, if his name were mentioned, would think his power limitless. Yet that power he dare not exert to save his own son from a felon's life and death. However much he or another may suffer, publicity must be avoided, and this is a secret which cannot safely be shared with more than those who know it now. How many know it? In this country, 3 persons. In an American prison, 1. Have you kept up communication with the young man? Oh, yes. Direct? No, through a third person. My young master has implored his father not to write to him direct. This go-between, as we may call him, is the third person in the secret. Who is he? That I dare not tell you. Mr. Sanderson, it would be much better for your master and his son that you should be more open with me. These half-confidences are misleading. Has the son made any suggestion regarding his release? Oh, yes, but not the suggestion I have put before you. His latest letter was to the effect that within 6 months or so there is to be an election for governor. He proposes that a large sum of money shall be used to influence this election, so that a man pledged to pardon him may sit in the governor's chair." "I see. And this sum of money is to be paid to the third person you referred to?" "Yes." "May I take it that this third person is the one to whom various sums have been paid during the last 5 years, in order to bribe the governor to pardon the young man?" Sanderson hesitated a moment before answering. In fact, he appeared so torn between inclination and duty, anxious to give me whatever information I deemed necessary, yet hemmed in by the instructions with which his master had limited him, that at last I waved my hand, and said, "You need not reply, Mr. Sanderson. That third party is the crux of the situation. I strongly suspect him of blackmail. If you would but name him, and allow me to lure him to these rooms, I possess a little private prison of my own into which I could thrust him, and I venture to say that before he had passed a week in darkness on bread and water, we should have the truth about this business. Look you now the illogical nature of an Englishman. Poor old Sanderson, who had come to me with a proposal to break the law of America, seemed horror-stricken when I airily suggested the immuring of a man in a dungeon here in England. He gazed at me in amazement, then cast his eyes furtively about him, as if afraid a trap-door would drop beneath him, and land him in my private oubliette. Do not be alarmed, Mr. Sanderson, you are perfectly safe. You are beginning at the wrong end of this business, and it seems to me 5 years of contributions to this third party without any result might have opened the eyes of even the most influential nobleman in England, not to mention those of his faithful servant." "Indeed, sir," said Sanderson, "I must confess to you that I have long had a suspicion of this third person, but my master has clung to him as his only hope, and if this third person were interfered with, I may tell you that he has deposited in London at some place unknown to us a full history of the case, and if it should happen that he disappears for more than a week at a time, this record will be brought to light. My dear Mr. Sanderson, that device is as old as Noah and his ark. I should chance that. Let me lay this fellow by the heels, and I will guarantee that no publicity follows." Sanderson sadly shook his head. "Everything might happen as you say, sir, but all that would put us no further forward. The only point is the liberation of my young master. It is possible that the person unmentioned, whom we may call number 3, has been cheating us throughout, but that is a matter of no consequence." "Pardon me, but I think it is. Suppose your young master here and at liberty. This number 3 would continue to maintain the power over him which he seems to have held over his father for the last 5 years. I think we can prevent that, sir, if my plan is carried out. The scheme for bribing the American officials is yours, then?" "Yes, sir, and I may say I am taking a great deal upon myself in coming to you. I am, in fact, disobeying the implied commands of my master, but I have seen him pay money, and very large sums of money, to this number 3 for the last 5 years, and nothing has come of it. My master is an unsuspicious man, who has seen little of the real world, and thinks everyone as honest as himself." "Well, that may be, Mr. Sanderson, but permit me to suggest that the one who proposes a scheme of bribery, and, to put it mildly, an evasion of the law, shows some knowledge of the lower levels of this world, and is not quite in a position to plume himself on his own honesty." "I am coming to that, Mr. Valmont. My master knows nothing whatever of my plan. He has given me the huge sum of money demanded by number 3, and he supposes that amount has been already paid over. As a matter of fact, it has not been paid over, and will not be until my suggestion has been carried out and failed. In fact, I am about to use this money, all of it if necessary, if you will undertake the commission. I have paid number 3 his usual monthly allowance, and will continue to do so. I have told him my master has his proposal under consideration, that there are still 6 months to come and go upon, and that my master is not one who decides in a hurry. Number 3 says there is an election in 6 months for governor. What is the name of the state?" Sanderson informed me. I walked to my bookcase and took down a current American yearbook, consulted it, and returned to the table. "There is no election in that state, Mr. Sanderson, for 18 months. Number 3 is simply a blackmailer, as I have suspected.' 'Quite so, sir,' replied Sanderson, taking a newspaper from his pocket. 'I read in this paper an account of a man immured in a Spanish dungeon. His friends arranged it with the officials in this way. The prisoner was certified to have died, and his body was turned over to his relatives. Now, if that could be done in America, it would serve two purposes. It would be the easiest way to get my young master out of the jail. It would remain a matter of record that he had died, therefore there could be no search for him, as would be the case if he simply escaped. If you were so good as to undertake this task, you might perhaps see my young master in his cell, and ask him to write to this number 3, with whom he is in constant communication, telling him he was very ill. Then you could arrange with the prison doctor that this person was informed of my young master's death.' 'Very well, we can try that. But a blackmailer is not so easily thrown off the scent. Once he has tasted blood, he is a human man-eating tiger. But still, there is always my private dungeon in the background, and if your plan for silencing him fails, I guarantee that my more drastic and equally illegal method will be a success.' It will be seen that my scruples concerning the acceptance of this commission, and my first dislike for the old man, had both faded away during the conversation which I have set down in the preceding chapter. I saw him under the stress of deep emotion, and latterly began to realise the tremendous chances he was taking in contravening the will of his imperious master. If the large sum of money was long withheld from the blackmailer, Douglas Sanderson ran the risk of number 3 opening communication direct with his master. Investigation would show that the old servant had come perilously near laying himself open to a charge of breach of trust, and even of defalcation with regard to the money, and all this danger he was heroically incurring for the unselfish purpose of serving the interests of his employer. During our long interview, old Sanderson gradually became a hero in my eyes, and entirely in opposition to the resolution I had made at the beginning, I accepted his commission at the end of it. Nevertheless, my American experiences are those of which I am least proud, and all I care to say upon the subject is that my expedition proved completely successful. The late convict was my companion on the Arontic, the first steamship sailing for England after we reached New York from the west. Of course I knew that 2 or 3 years roughing it in mining camps and on ranches, followed by 5 years in prison, must have produced a radical effect not only on the character but also in the personal appearance of a man who had undergone these privations. Nevertheless, making due allowance for all this, I could not but fear that the ancient English family of which this young man was the hope and pride would be exceedingly disappointed with him. In spite of the change which grooming and the wearing of a civilized costume made, Wyoming Ed still looked much more the criminal than the gentleman. I considered myself in honour bound not to make any inquiries of the young man regarding his parentage. Of course, if I had wished to possess myself of the secret, I had but to touch a button under the table when Sanderson left my rooms in the Imperial Flats, which would have caused him to be shadowed and run to earth. I may also add that the ex-prisoner volunteered no particulars about himself or his family. Only once on board ship did he attempt to obtain some information from me, as we walked up and down the deck together. "You're acting for someone else, I suppose?" he said. "Yes." "For someone in England?" "Yes." "He put up the money, did he?" "Yes." There was a pause, during which we took 2 or 3 turns in silence. "Of course there's no secret about it," he said at last. "I expected help from the other side, but Colonel Jim has been so mighty long about it, I was afraid he'd forgotten me." "Who is Colonel Jim?" "Colonel Jim Baxter. Wasn't it him gave you the money?" "I never heard of the man before." "Then who put up the coin?" "Douglas Sanderson," I replied, looking at him sideways as I mentioned the name. It had apparently no effect upon him. He wrinkled his brow for a moment, and then said, "Well, if you never heard of Baxter, I never heard of Sanderson." This led me to suspect that Douglas Sanderson did not give me his own name, and doubtless the address with which he had furnished me was merely temporary. I did not cable to him from America regarding the success of the expedition, because I could not be certain it was a success until I was safely on English ground, and not even then, to tell the truth. Anyhow, I wished to leave no trail behind me, but the moment the Arontic reached Liverpool, I telegraphed Sanderson to meet us that evening at my flat. He was waiting for me when Wyoming Ed and I entered together. The old man was quite evidently in a state of nervous tension. He had been walking up and down the room with hands clenched behind his back, and now stood at the end farthest from the door as he heard us approach, with his hands still clasped behind his back, and an expression of deep anxiety upon his rugged face. All the electric lamps were turned on, and the room was bright as day. "Have you not brought him with you?" he cried. "Brought him with me?" I echoed. "Here is Wyoming Ed." The old man glared at him for a moment or two, stupefied, and then moaned, "Oh, my God, that is not the man." I turned to my short-haired fellow-traveller. "You told me you were Wyoming Ed." He laughed uneasily. "Well, in a manner of speaking, so I have been for the last 5 years, but I wasn't Wyoming Ed before that. Say, old man, are you acting for Colonel Jim Baxter?" Sanderson, on whom a dozen years seemed to have fallen since we entered the room, appeared unable to speak, and merely shook his head in a hopeless sort of way. "I say, boys," ejaculated the ex-convict with an uneasy laugh, half comic, half bewildered, "this is a sort of mix-up, isn't it? I wish Colonel Jim was here to explain. I say, boss," he cried suddenly, turning sharp on me, "this here misfit's not my fault. I didn't change the children in the cradle. You don't intend to send me back to that hell-hole, do you?" "No," I said, "not if you tell the truth. Sit down." The late prisoner seated himself in a chair as close to the door as possible, hitching a little nearer as he sat down. His face had taken on a sharp, crafty aspect, like that of a trapped rat. "You are perfectly safe," I assured him. "Sit over here by the table. Even if you bolted through that door, you couldn't get out of this flat. Mr. Sanderson, take a chair." The old man sank despondently into the one nearest at hand. I pressed a button, and when my servant entered, I said to him, "Bring some cognac and Scotch whisky, glasses, and 2 siphons of soda." "You haven't got any Kentucky or Canadian?" asked the prisoner, moistening his lips. The jail whiteness in his face was now accentuated by the pallor of fear, and the haunted look of the escaped convict glimmered in his eyes. In spite of the comfort I had attempted to bestow upon him, he knew that he had been rescued in mistake for another, and for the first time since he left prison realized he was among strangers, and not among friends. In his trouble he turned to the beverage of his native continent. "Bring a bottle of Canadian whisky," I said to the servant, who disappeared, and shortly returned with what I had ordered. I locked the door after him and put the key in my pocket. "What am I to call you?" I asked the ex-convict. With a forced laugh, he said, "You can call me Jack for short." "Very well, Jack, help yourself." And he poured out a very liberal glass of the Dominion liquor, refusing to dilute it with soda. Sanderson took Scotch, and I helped myself to a petit verre of brandy. "Now, Jack," I began, "I may tell you plainly that if I wished to send you back to prison, I could not do so without incriminating myself. You are legally dead, and you have now a chance to begin life anew, an opportunity of which I hope you will take advantage. If you were to apply 3 weeks from today at the prison doors, they would not dare admit you. You are dead. Does that console you?" "Well, Squire, you can bet your bottom dollar I never thought I'd be pleased to hear I was dead, but I'm glad if it's all fixed as you say, and you can bet your last pair of boots I'm going to keep out of the jug in future if I can." "That's right. Now I can promise that if you answer all my questions truthfully, you shall be given money enough to afford you a new beginning in life. Good enough? said Jack, briefly. "You were known in prison as Wyoming Ed?" "Yes, sir." "If that was not your name, why did you use it?" "Because Colonel Jim on the train asked me to do that. He said it would give him a pull in England to get me free." "Did you know Wyoming Ed?" "Yes, sir. He was one of us three that held up the train." "What became of him?" "He was shot dead." "By one of the passengers?" There was silence, during which the old man groaned and bowed his head. Jack was studying the floor. Then he looked up at me and said, "You don't expect me to give a pal away, do you?" "As that pal has given you away for the last 5 years, it seems to me you need not show very much consideration for him." "I'm not so sure he did." "I am, but never mind that point. Colonel Jim Baxter shot Wyoming Ed and killed him. Why?" "See here, my friend, you're going a little too fast. I didn't say that." He reached somewhat defiantly for the bottle from Canada. "Pardon me," I said, rising quietly and taking possession of the bottle myself. "It grieves me more than I can say to restrict my hospitality. I have never done such a thing in my life before, but this is not a drinking bout. It is a very serious conference. The whisky you have already taken has given you a bogus courage and a false view of things. Are you going to tell me the truth, or are you not?" Jack pondered on this for a while, and then he said, "Well, sir, I'm perfectly willing to tell you the truth as far as it concerns myself, but I don't want to rat on a friend." "As I have said, he isn't your friend. He told you to take the name of Wyoming Ed so that he might blackmail the father of Wyoming Ed. He has done so for the last 5 years, living in luxury here in London and not moving a finger to help you. In fact, nothing would appall him more than to learn that you are now in this country. By this time he has probably received the news from the prison doctor that you are dead, and so thinks himself safe forever." "If you can prove that to me," said Jack. "I can and will," I interrupted. Then, turning to Sanderson, I demanded, "When are you to meet this man next?" "Tonight at 9 o'clock," he answered. "His monthly payment is due, and he is clamouring for the large sum I told you of." "Where do you meet him? In London?" "Yes." "At your master's town house?" "Yes." "Will you take us there, and place us where we can see him and he can't see us?" "Yes, I trust to your honour, Mr. Valmont. A closed carriage will call for me at 8, and you can accompany me. Still, after all, Mr. Valmont, we have no assurance that he is the same person this young man refers to." "I am certain he is. He does not go under the name of Colonel Jim Baxter, I suppose?" "No." The convict had been looking from one to the other of us during this colloquy. Suddenly he drew his chair up closer to the table. "Look here," he said, "you fellows are square, I can see that, and after all's said and done, you're the man that got me out of clink. Now, I half suspicion you're right about Colonel Jim, but anyhow, I'll tell you exactly what happened. Colonel Jim was a Britisher, and I suppose that's why he and Wyoming Ed chummed together a good deal. We called Jim Baxter Colonel, but he never said he was a colonel or anything else. I was told he belonged to the British Army, and that something happened in India, so that he had to light out. He never talked about himself, but he was a mighty taking fellow when he laid out to please anybody. We called him Colonel because he was so straight in the back, and walked as if he were on parade. When this young English tenderfoot came out, he and the Colonel got to be as thick as thieves, and the Colonel won a good deal of money from him at cards, but that didn't make any difference in their friendship. The Colonel almost always won when he played cards, and perhaps that's what started the talk about why he left the British Army. He was the luckiest beggar I ever knew in that line of business. We all met in the rush to the new goldfields, which didn't pan out worth a cent, and one after another of the fellows quit and went somewhere else. But Wyoming Ed, he held on, even after Colonel Jim wanted to quit. As long as there were plenty of fellows there, Colonel Jim never lacked money, although he didn't dig it out of the ground. But when the population thinned down to only a few of us, then we all struck hard times. Now I knew Colonel Jim was going to hold up a train.
He asked me if I'd join him, and I said I would if there wasn't too many in the gang. I'd been into that business afore, and I knew there was no greater danger than to have a whole mob of fellows. 3 men can hold up a train better than 3 dozen. Everybody's scared except the express messenger, and it's generally easy to settle him, for he stands where the light is, and we shoot from the dark. Well, I thought at first Wyoming Ed was on to the scheme, because when we were waiting in the cut to signal the train, he talked about us going on with her to San Francisco. For I thought he was only joking. I guess that Colonel Jim imagined that when it came to the pinch, Ed wouldn't back out and leave us in the lurch. He knew Ed was as brave as a lion. In the cut, where the train would be on the upgrade, the Colonel got his lantern ready, lit it, and wrapped a thin red silk handkerchief round it. The express was timed to pass up there about midnight, but it was near 1 o'clock when a headlight came in sight. We knew all the passengers would be in bed in the sleepers and asleep in the smoking car and the day coach. We didn't intend to meddle with them. The Colonel had brought a stick or 2 of dynamite from the mines and was going to blow open the safe in the express car and climb out with whatever was inside. The train stopped to the signal all right, and the Colonel fired a couple of shots just to let the engineer know we meant business. The engineer and fireman at once threw up their hands, and then the Colonel turns to Ed, who was standing there like a man poleaxed, and says to him mighty sharp, just like as if he was speaking to a regiment of soldiers, "You keep these 2 men covered. Come on, Jack," he says to me, and then we steps up to the door of the express car, which the fellow inside had got locked and bolted. The Colonel fires his revolver in through the lock, then flung his shoulder agin the door, and it went in with a crash, which was followed instantly by another crash, for the little expressman was game right through. He'd put out the lights and was blazing away at the open door. The Colonel sprang for cover inside the car and wasn't touched, but one of the shots took me just above the knee and broke my leg, so I went down in a heap. The minute the Colonel counted 7 shots, he was onto that express messenger like a tiger and had him tied up in a hard knot before he could shake a stick. Then, quick as a wink, he struck a match and lit the lamp. Plucky as the express messenger was, he looked scared to death, and now when Colonel Jim held a pistol to his head, he gave up the keys and told him how to open the safe. I had fallen back against the corner of the car inside and was groaning with pain. Colonel Jim was scooping out the money from the shelves of the safe and stuffing it into a sack. "Are you hurt, Jack?" he cried. "Yeah, my leg's broke." "Don't let that trouble you. We'll get you clear all right. Do you think you can ride your horse?" "I don't believe it," I said. "I guess I'm done for." And I thought I was. Colonel Jim never looked round, but he went through that safe in a way that'd make your hair curl, throwing aside the bulky packages after tearing them open, taking only cash, which he thrust into a bag he had with him, till he was loaded like a millionaire. Then suddenly he swore, for the train began to move. "What's that fool Ed doing?" he shouted, rising to his feet. At that minute Ed came in, pistol in each hand, and his face ablaze. "Here, you cursed thief!" he cried. "I didn't come with you to rob a train." "Get outside, you fool!" roared Colonel Jim. "Get outside and stop this train. Jack's got his leg broke. Don't come another step toward me, or I'll kill you." But Ed, he walked right on, Colonel Jim backing. Then there was a shot that rang like cannon fire in the closed car, and Ed fell forward on his face. Colonel Jim turned him over, and I saw he'd been hit square in the middle of the forehead. The train was now going at good speed, and we were already miles away from where our horses were tied. I never heard a man swear like Colonel Jim. He went through the pockets of Ed and took a bundle of papers that was inside his coat, and this he stuffed away in his own clothes. Then he turned to me, and his voice was like a lamb. "Jack, old man," he said, "I can't help you. They're going to nab you, but not for murder. The expressman there will be your witness. It isn't murder anyhow on my part, but self-defence. You saw he was coming at me when I warned him to keep away." All this he said in a loud voice for the expressman to hear, and then he bent over to me and whispered, "I'll get the best lawyer I can for you, but I'm afraid they're bound to convict you, and if they do, I'll spend every penny of this money to get you free. You call yourself Wyoming Ed at the trial. I've taken all this man's papers so that he can't be identified, And don't you worry if you're sentenced, for remember I'll be working night and day for you, and if money can get you out, you'll be got out, because these papers will help me to get the cash required. Ed's folks are rich in England, so they'll fork over to get you out if you pretend to be him." With that he bade me good-bye and jumped off the train. There, gentlemen, that's the whole story just as it happened, and that's why I thought it was Colonel Jim had sent you to get me free. There was not the slightest doubt in my mind that the convict had told the exact truth, and that night at 9 o'clock he identified Major Wren as the former Colonel Jim Baxter. Sanderson placed us in a gallery where we could see, but could not hear. The old man seemed determined that we should not know where we were, and took every precaution to keep us in the dark. I suppose he put us out of earshot, so that if the Major mentioned the name of the nobleman we should not be any the wiser. We remained in the gallery for some time after the Major had left, before Sanderson came to us again, carrying with him a packet. "The carriage is waiting at the door," he said, "and with your permission, Monsieur Valmont, I will accompany you to your flat." I smiled at the old man's extreme caution, but he continued very gravely, "It's not that, Monsieur Valmont. I wish to consult with you, and if you will accept it, I have another commission to offer." "Well," said I hope it's not so unsavoury as the last," but to this the old man made no response. There was silence in the carriage as we drove back to my flat. Sanderson had taken the precaution of pulling down the blinds of the carriage, which he need not have troubled to do, for, as I have said, it would have been the simplest matter in the world for me to have discovered who his employer was, if I had desired to know. As a matter of fact, I do not know to this day whom he represented. Once more in my room, with the electric light turned on, I was shocked and astonished to see the expression on Sanderson's face. It was the face of a man who would grimly commit murder and hang for it. If ever the thirst for vengeance was portrayed on a human countenance, it was on his that night. He spoke very quietly, laying down the packet before him on the table. "I think you will agree with me," he said, "that no punishment on earth is too severe for that creature calling himself Major Wren." "I'm willing to shoot him dead in the streets of London tomorrow," said the convict, "if you give the word." Sanderson went on implacably. "He not only murdered the son, but for 5 years has kept the father in an agony of sorrow and apprehension, bleeding him of money all the time, which was the least of his crimes. Tomorrow I shall tell my master that his son has been dead these 5 years, and, heavy as that blow must prove, it will be mitigated by the fact that his son died an honest and honourable man. I thank you for offering to kill this vile criminal. I intend that he shall die, but not so quickly or so mercifully." Here he untied the packet, and took from it a photograph which he handed to the convict. "Do you recognise that?" "Oh, yes, that's Wyoming Ed, as he appeared at the mine, as indeed he appeared when he was shot." The photograph Sanderson then handed to me. "An article that I read about you in the paper, Monsieur Valmont, said you could impersonate anybody. Can you impersonate this young man?" "There's no difficulty in that," I replied. "Then will you do this? I wish you, too, to dress in that fashion. I shall give you particulars of the haunts of Major Wren. I want you to meet him, together and separately, as often as you can, until you drive him mad or to suicide." "He believes you to be dead," said Sanderson, addressing Jack. "I am certain he has the news by his manner tonight. He is extremely anxious to get the lump sum of money which I have been holding back from him. You may address him, for he will recognise your voice as well as your person. But Monsieur Valmont had better not speak, as then he might know it was not the voice of my poor young master. I suggest that you meet him first together, always at night. The rest I leave in your hands, Monsieur Valmont." With that the old man rose and left us. Perhaps I should stop this narration here, for I have often wondered if practically I am guilty of manslaughter. We did not meet Major Wren together, but arranged that he should encounter Jack under one lamp-post and me under the next. It was just after midnight, and the streets were practically deserted. The theatre crowds had gone, and the traffic was represented by the last buses, and a belated cab now and then. Major Wren came down the steps of his club, and under the first lamp-post, with the light shining full upon him, Jack the convict stepped forth. "Colonel Jim," he said, "Ed and I are waiting for you. There were 3 in that robbery, and 1 was a traitor. His dead comrades asked the traitor to join them." The Major staggered back against the lamp-post, drew his hand across his brow, and muttered, Jack told me afterwards, "I must stop drinking. I must stop drinking." Then he pulled himself together and walked rapidly toward the next lamp-post. I stood out square in front of him, but made no sound. He looked at me with distended eyes, while Jack shouted out in his boisterous voice, that had no doubt often echoed over the plain, "Come on, Wyoming Ed, and never mind him. He must follow." Then he gave a war whoop. The Major did not turn round, but continued to stare at me, breathing stertorously like a person with apoplexy. I slowly pushed back my hat, and on my brow he saw the red mark of a bullet hole. He threw up his hands and fell with a crash to the pavement. Heart failure was the verdict of the coroner's jury. End of chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chet Chris, London, UK. The Triumphs of Eugene Valmont, by Robert Barr. Chapter 8. Lady Alicia's Emeralds. Many Englishmen, if you speak to them of me, indulge themselves in a detraction that I hope they will not mind my saying is rarely graced by the delicacy of innuendo with which some of my own countrymen attempt to diminish whatever merit I may possess. Mr. Spencer Hale, of Scotland Yard, whose lack of imagination I have so often endeavoured to amend, alas, without perceptible success, was good enough to say, after I had begun these reminiscences, which he read with affected scorn, that I was wise in setting down my successes, because the life of Methuselah himself would not be long enough to chronicle my failures. And the man to whom this was said replied that it was only my artfulness, a word of which these people are very fond, that I intended to use my successes as bait, issue a small pamphlet filled with them, and then record my failures in 1,000 volumes, after the plan of a Chinese encyclopaedia, selling these to the public on the instalment plan. Ah, well, it is not for me to pass comment on such observations. Every profession is marred by its little jealousies, and why should the coterie of detection be exempt? I hope I may never follow an example so deleterious, and thus be tempted to express my contempt for the stupidity with which, as all persons know, the official detective system of England is imbued. I have had my failures, of course. Did I ever pretend to be otherwise than human? But what has been the cause of these failures? They have arisen through the conservatism of the English. When there is a mystery to be solved, the average Englishman almost invariably places it in the hands of the regular police. When these good people are utterly baffled, when their big boots have crushed out all evidences that the grounds may have had to offer to a discerning mind, when their clumsy hands have obliterated the clues which are everywhere around them, I am at last called in, and if I fail, they say, "What could you expect? He's a Frenchman." This was exactly what happened in the case of Lady Alicia's emeralds. For 2 months the regular police were not only befogged, but they blatantly sounded the alarm to every thief in Europe. All the pawnbrokers' shops of Great Britain were ransacked, as if a robber of so valuable a collection would be foolish enough to take it to a pawnbroker. Of course, the police say that they thought the thief would dismantle the cluster and sell the gems separately. As to this necklace of emeralds, possessing as it does an historical value which is probably in excess of its intrinsic worth, what more natural than that the holder of it should open negotiations with its rightful owner, and thus make more money by quietly restoring it than by its dismemberment and sale piecemeal? But such a fuss was kicked up, such a furore created, that it is no wonder the receiver of the goods lay low and said nothing. In vain were all ports giving access to the Continent watched. In vain were the police of France, Belgium, and Holland warned to look out for this treasure. 2 valuable months were lost, and then the Marquis of Blair sent for me. I maintain that the case was hopeless from the moment I took it up. It may be asked why the Marquis of Blair allowed the regular police to blunder along for 2 precious months, but anyone who is acquainted with that nobleman will not wonder that he clung so long to a forlorn hope. Very few members of the House of Peers are richer than Lord Blair, and still fewer more penurious. He maintained that, as he paid his taxes, he was entitled to protection from theft, that it was the duty of the government to restore the gems, and if this proved impossible, to make compensation for them. This theory is not acceptable in the English courts, and while Scotland Yard did all it could during those 2 months, what but failure was to be expected from its limited mental equipment? When I arrived at the Manor of Blair, as his lordship's very ugly and somewhat modern mansion house is termed, I was instantly admitted to his presence. I had been summoned from London by a letter in his lordship's own hand, on which the postage was not paid. It was late in the afternoon when I arrived, and our first conference was what might be termed futile. It was taken up entirely with haggling about terms, the Marquis endeavouring to beat down the price of my services to a sum so insignificant that it would barely have paid my expenses from London to Blair and back. Such bargaining is intensely distasteful to me. When the Marquis found all his offers declined with a politeness which left no opening for anger on his part, he endeavoured to induce me to take up the case on a commission contingent upon my recovery of the gems, and as I had declined this for the 20th time, darkness had come on, and the gong rang for dinner. I dined alone in the salle à manger, which appeared to be set apart for those calling at the mansion on business, and the meagreness of the fare, together with the indifferent nature of the claret, strengthened my determination to return to London as early as possible next morning. When the repast was finished, the dignified serving-man said gravely to me, "The Lady Alicia asks if you will be good enough to give her a few moments in the drawing-room, sir." I followed the man to the drawing-room, and found the young lady seated at the piano, on which she was strumming idly and absent-mindedly, but with a touch nevertheless that indicated advanced excellence in the art of music. She was not dressed as one who had just risen from the dining-table, but was somewhat grimly and commonly attired, looking more like a cottager's daughter than a member of a great country family. Her head was small, and crowned with a mass of jet-black hair. My first impression on entering the large, rather dimly lighted room was unfavourable, but that vanished instantly under the charm of a manner so graceful and vivacious that in a moment I seemed to be standing in a brilliant Parisian salon, rather than in the sombre drawing-room of an English country house. Every poise of her dainty head, every gesture of those small perfect hands, every modulated tone of the voice, whether sparkling with laughter or caressing in confidential speech, reminded me of the grande dame of my own land. It was strange to find this perfect human flower amidst the gloomy ugliness of a huge square house built in the time of the Georges. But I remembered now that the Blairs are the English equivalent of the de Bellairs of France, from which family sprang the fascinating Marquise de Bellairs, who adorned the court of Louis XIV. Here, advancing towards me, was the very reincarnation of the lovely Marquise, who gave lustre to this dull world nearly 300 years ago. Ah, after all, what are the English but a conquered race? I often forget this, and I trust I never remind them of it, but it enables one to forgive them much. A vivid 20th century marquise was Lady Alicia, in all except attire. What a dream some of our Parisian dress artists could have made of her! And here she was immured in this dull English house, in a high-necked costume of a labourer's wife. "Welcome, Monsieur Valmont," she cried in French of almost faultless intonation. "I am so glad you have arrived." And she greeted me as if I were an old friend of the family. There was nothing of condescension in her manner, no display of her own affability, while at the same time teaching me my place, and the difference in our stations in life. I can stand the rudeness of the nobility, but I detest their condescension. No, Lady Alicia was a true de Bel-Air, and in my confusion, bending over her slender hand, I said, "Madame la Marquise, it is a privilege to extend to you my most respectful salutations." She laughed at this quietly, with the melting laugh of the nightingale. "Monsieur, you mistake my title. Although my uncle is a marquis, I am but Lady Alicia." "Your pardon, my lady. For the moment I was back in that scintillating court which surrounded Louis le Grand." "How flatteringly you introduce yourself, monsieur. In the gallery upstairs there is a painting of the Marquise de Bel-Air, and when I show it to you tomorrow you will then understand how charmingly you have pleased a vain woman by your reference to that beautiful lady. But I must not talk in this frivolous strain, monsieur. There is serious business to be considered, and I assure you I looked forward to your coming, monsieur, with the eagerness of Sister Anne in the Tower of Bluebeard." I fear my expression as I bowed to her must have betrayed my gratification at hearing these words, so confidentially uttered by lips so sweet, while the glance of her lovely eyes was even more eloquent than her words. Instantly I felt ashamed of my chaffering over terms with her uncle. Instantly I forgot my resolution to depart on the morrow. Instantly I resolved to be of what assistance I could to this dainty lady. Alas! the heart of Valmont is to-day as unprotected against the artillery of inspiring eyes as ever it was in his extreme youth. "This house," she continued vivaciously, "has been practically in a state of siege for 2 months. I could take none of my usual walks in the gardens, on the lawns, or through the park, without some clumsy policeman in uniform crashing his way through the bushes, or some detective in plain clothes accosting me and questioning me under the pretence that he was a stranger who had lost his way. The lack of all subtlety in our police is something deplorable. I am sure the real criminal might have passed through their hands a dozen times unmolested, while our poor innocent servants and the strangers within our gates were made to feel that the stern eye of the law was upon them night and day." The face of the young lady was an entrancing picture of animated indignation, as she gave utterance to this truism, which her countrymen are so slow to appreciate. I experienced a glow of satisfaction. "Yes," she went on, "they sent down from London an army of stupid men, who have kept our household in a state of abject terror for 8 long weeks, and where are the emeralds?" As she suddenly asked this question in the most Parisian of accents, with a little outward spreading of the hand, a flash of the eye, and a toss of the head, the united effect was something indescribable through the limitations of the language I am compelled to use. "Well, monsieur, your arrival has put to flight this tiresome brigade, if indeed the word flight is not too airy a term to use towards a company so elephantine, and I assure you a sigh of relief has gone up from the whole household, with the exception of my uncle. I said to him at dinner tonight, if Monsieur Valmont had been induced to take an interest in the case at first, the jewels would have been in my possession long before tonight." "Ah, my lady," I protested, "I fear you overrate my poor ability. It is quite true that if I had been called in on the night of the robbery, my chances of success would have been infinitely greater than they are now." "Monsieur," she cried, clasping her hands over her knees and leaning towards me, hypnotizing me with those starry eyes, "Monsieur, I am perfectly confident that before a week is past you will restore the necklace, if such restoration be possible. I have said so from the first. Now, am I right in my conjecture, monsieur, that you come here alone, that you bring with you no train of followers and assistants?" "That is as you have stated it, my lady." "I was sure of it. It is to be a contest of trained mentality in opposition to our 2 months' experience of brute force. Never before had I felt such ambition to succeed, and a determination not to disappoint took full possession of me. Appreciation is a needed stimulant, and here it was offered to me in its most intoxicating form. Ah, Valmont, Valmont, will you never grow old? I am sure that at this moment, if I had been 80, the same thrill of enthusiasm would have tingled to my fingers' ends. Leave the Manor of Blair in the morning? Not for the Bank of France. Has my uncle acquainted you with particulars of the robbery? No, madame, we were talking of other things. The lady leaned back in her low chair, partially closed her eyes, and breathed a deep sigh. "I can well imagine the subject of your conversation," she said at last. "The Marquis of Blair was endeavouring to impose usurer's terms upon you, while you, nobly scorning such mercenary considerations, had perhaps resolved to leave us at the earliest opportunity. I assure you, my lady, that if any such conclusion had been arrived at on my part, it vanished the moment I was privileged to set foot in this drawing-room. It is kind of you to say that, monsieur, but you must not allow your conversation with my uncle to prejudice you against him. He is an old man now, and of course has his fancies. You would think him mercenary, perhaps, and so he is, but then so too am I. Oh yes, I am, monsieur, frightfully mercenary. To be mercenary, I believe, means to be fond of money. No one is fonder of money than I, except perhaps my uncle. But you see, monsieur, we occupy the two extremes. He is fond of money to hoard it. I am fond of money to spend it. I am fond of money for the things it will buy. I should like to scatter largesse as did my fair ancestress in France. I should love a manor-house in the country and a mansion in Mayfair. I could wish to make everyone around me happy, if the expenditure of money would do it. That is a form of money-love, Lady Alicia, which will find a multitude of admirers." The girl shook her head and laughed merrily. "I should so dislike to forfeit your esteem, Monsieur Valmont, and therefore I shall not reveal the depth of my cupidity. You will learn that probably from my uncle, and then you will understand my extreme anxiety for the recovery of these jewels. Are they very valuable? Oh, yes. The necklace consists of 20 stones, no one of which weighs less than an ounce. Altogether I believe they amount to 2,400 or 2,500 carats, and their intrinsic value is £20 a carat at least. So you see that means nearly £50,000. Yet even this sum is trivial compared with what it involves. There is something like £1 million at stake, together with my coveted manor-house in the country and my equally coveted mansion in Mayfair. All this is within my grasp if I can but recover the emeralds." The girl blushed prettily as she noticed how intently I regarded her while she evolved this tantalizing mystery. I thought there was a trace of embarrassment in her laugh when she cried, "Oh, what will you think of me when you understand the situation? Pray, pray do not judge me harshly. I assure you the position I aim at will be used for the good of others as well as for my own pleasure. If my uncle does not make a confidant of you, I must take my courage in both hands and give you all the particulars, but not tonight. Of course, if one is to unravel such a snarl as that in which we find ourselves, he must be made aware of every particular, must he not?" "Certainly, my lady." "Very well, Monsieur Valmont, I shall supply any deficiencies that occur in my uncle's conversation with you. There is one point on which I should like to warn you. Both my uncle and the police have made up their minds that a certain young man is the culprit. The police found several clues which apparently led in his direction, but they were unable to find enough to justify his arrest. At first I could have sworn he had nothing whatever to do with the matter, but lately I am not so sure. All I ask of you until we secure another opportunity of consulting together is to preserve an open mind. Please do not allow my uncle to prejudice you against him. What is the name of this young man? He is the Honourable John Haddon. The Honourable? Is he a person who could do so dishonourable an action? The young lady shook her head. I am almost sure he would not, and yet one never can tell. I think at the present moment there are 1 or 2 noble lords in prison, but their crimes have not been mere vulgar housebreaking. Am I to infer, Lady Alicia, that you are in possession of certain facts unknown either to your uncle or the police? Yes. Pardon me, but do these facts tend to incriminate the young man? Again the young lady leaned back in her chair and gazed past me, a wrinkle of perplexity on her fair brow. Then she said very slowly, You will understand, Monsieur Valmont, how loath I am to speak against one who was formerly a friend. If he had been content to remain a friend, I am sure this incident, which has caused us all such worry and trouble, would never have happened. I do not wish to dwell on what my uncle will tell you was a very unpleasant episode, but the Honourable John Haddon is a poor man, and it is quite out of the question for one brought up as I have been to marry into poverty. He was very headstrong and reckless about the matter, and involved my uncle in a bitter quarrel while discussing it, much to my chagrin and disappointment. It is as necessary for him to marry wealth as it is for me to make a good match, but he could not be brought to see that. Oh, he is not at all a sensible young man, and my former friendship for him has ceased. Yet I should dislike very much to take any action that might harm him. Therefore I have spoken to no one but you about the evidence that is in my hands, and this you must treat as entirely confidential, giving no hint to my uncle, who is already bitter enough against Mr. Haddon. Does this evidence convince you that he stole the necklace? No, I do not believe that he actually stole it, but I am persuaded he was an accessory after the fact. Is that the legal term? Now, Monsieur Valmont, we will say no more tonight. If I talk any longer about this crisis, I shall not sleep, and I wish, assured of your help, to attack the situation with a very clear mind tomorrow. When I retired to my room, I found that I, too, could not sleep, although I needed a clear mind to face the problem of tomorrow. It is difficult for me to describe accurately the effect this interview had upon my mind, but to use a bodily simile, I may say that it seemed as if I had indulged too freely in a subtle champagne, which appeared exceedingly excellent at first, but from which the exhilaration had now departed. No man could have been more completely under a spell than I was when Lady Alicia's eyes first told me more than her lips revealed. But although I had challenged her right to the title mercenary when she applied it to herself, I could not but confess that her nonchalant recital regarding the friend who desired to be a lover jarred upon me. I found my sympathy extending itself to that unknown young man, on whom it appeared the shadow of suspicion already rested. I was confident that if he had actually taken the emeralds, it was not at all from motives of cupidity. Indeed, that was practically shown by the fact that Scotland Yard found itself unable to trace the jewels, which at least they might have done if the necklace had been sold either as a whole or dismembered. Of course, an emerald weighing an ounce is by no means unusual. The Hope emerald, for example, weighs 6 ounces, and the gem owned by the Duke of Devonshire measures 2 1/4 inches through its greatest diameter. Nevertheless, such a constellation as the Blair emeralds was not to be disposed of very easily, and I surmised no attempt had been made either to sell them or to raise money upon them. Now that I had removed myself from the glamour of her presence, I began to suspect that the young lady, after all, although undoubtedly possessing the brilliancy of her jewels, retained also something of their hardness. There had been no expression of sympathy for the discarded friend. It was too evident, recalling what had latterly passed between us, that the young woman's sole desire, and a perfectly natural desire, was to recover her missing treasure. There was something behind all this which I could not comprehend, and I resolved in the morning to question the Marquis of Blair as shrewdly as he cared to allow. Failing him, I should cross-question the niece in a somewhat drier light than that which had enshrouded me during this interesting evening. I care not who knows it, but I have been befooled more than once by a woman. But I determined that in clear daylight I should resist the hypnotizing influence of those glorious eyes. Mon Dieu, mon Dieu, how easy it is for me to make good resolutions when I am far from temptation. It was 10 o'clock next morning when I was admitted to the study of the aged bachelor Marquis of Blair. His keen eyes looked through and through me as I seated myself before him. "Well," he said shortly. "My lord," I began deliberately, "I know nothing more of the case than was furnished by the accounts I have read in the newspapers. 2 months have elapsed since the robbery. Every day that passed made the detection of the criminal more difficult. I do not wish to waste either my time or your money on a forlorn hope. If, therefore, you will be good enough to place me in possession of all the facts known to you, I shall tell you at once whether or not I can take up the case." "Do you wish me to give you the name of the criminal?" asked his lordship. "Is his name known to you?" I asked in return. "Yes, John Haddon stole the necklace." "Did you give that name to the police?" "Yes." "Why didn't they arrest him?" "Because the evidence against him is so small, and the improbability of his having committed the crime is so great." "What is the evidence against him?" His lordship spoke with the dry deliberation of an aged solicitor. "The robbery was committed on the night of October the 5th. All day there had been a heavy rain, and the grounds were wet. For reasons into which I do not care to enter, John Haddon was familiar with this house and with our grounds. He was well known to my servants, and, unfortunately, popular with them, for he is an open-handed spendthrift. The estate of his elder brother, Lord Steffenham, adjoins my own to the west, and Lord Steffenham's house is 3 miles from where we sit. On the night of the 5th a ball was given in the mansion of Lord Steffenham, to which, of course, my niece and myself were invited, and which invitation was accepted. I had no quarrel with the elder brother. It was known to John Haddon that my niece intended to wear her necklace of emeralds. The robbery occurred at a time when most crimes of that nature are committed in country houses, namely while we were at dinner, an hour during which the servants are almost invariably in the lower part of the house. In October the days are getting short. The night was exceptionally dark, for although the rain had ceased, not a star was visible. The thief placed a ladder against the sill of one of the upper windows, opened it, and came in. He must have been perfectly familiar with the house, for there are evidences that he went direct to the boudoir where the jewel case had been carelessly left on my niece's dressing-table when she came down to dinner. It had been taken from the strong-room about an hour before. The box was locked, but of course that made no difference. The thief wrenched the lid off, breaking the lock, stole the necklace, and escaped by the way he came. Did he leave the window open and the ladder in place? Yes. Doesn't that strike you as very extraordinary? No. I do not assert that he is a professional burglar who would take all the precautions against the discovery that might have been expected from one of the craft. Indeed, the man's carelessness in going straight across the country to his brother's house and leaving footsteps in the soft earth, easily traceable almost to the very boundary fence, shows he is incapable of any serious thought. Is John Haddon rich? He hasn't a penny. Did you go to the ball that night? Yes, I had promised to go. Was John Haddon there? Yes, but he appeared late. He should have been present at the opening, and his brother was seriously annoyed by his absence. When he did come, he acted in a wild and reckless manner, which gave the guests the impression he had been drinking. Both my niece and myself were disgusted with his actions. Do you think your niece suspects him? She certainly did not at first, and was indignant when I told her, coming home from the ball, that her jewels were undoubtedly in Steffenham House, even though they were not round her neck. But latterly I think her opinion has changed. To go back a moment, did any of your servants see him prowling about the place? They all say they didn't, but I myself saw him just before dusk, coming across the fields towards this house, and next morning we found the same footprints both going and coming. It seems to me the circumstantial evidence is rather strong. It's a pity that no one but yourself saw him. What more evidence are the authorities waiting for? They're waiting until he attempts to dispose of the jewels. You think, then, he has not done so up to date? I think he will never do so. Then why did he steal them? To prevent the marriage of my niece with Jonas Carter of Sheffield, to whom she is betrothed. They were to be married early in the new year. My lord, you amaze me. If Mr. Carter and Lady Alicia are engaged, why should the theft of the jewels interfere with the ceremony? Mr. Jonas Carter's a most estimable man, who, however, does not move in our sphere of life. He is connected with the steel or cutlery industry, and is a person of great wealth, rising upwards of £1 million, with a large estate in Derbyshire, and a house fronting Hyde Park in London. He is a very strict businessman, and both my niece and myself agree that he is also an eligible man. I myself am rather strict in matters of business, and I must admit that Mr. Carter showed a very generous spirit in arranging the preliminaries of the engagement with me. When Alicia's father died, he had run through all the money he himself possessed or could borrow from his friends. Although a man of noble birth, I never liked him. He was married to my only sister. The Blair emeralds, as perhaps you know, descend down the female line. They therefore came to my niece from her mother. My poor sister had long been disillusioned before death released her from the titled scamp she had married, and she very wisely placed the emeralds in my custody to be held in trust for her daughter. They constitute my niece's only fortune, and would produce, if offered in London today, probably £75,000 or £100,000, although actually they are not worth so much. Mr. Jonas Carter very amiably consented to receive my niece with a dowry of only £50,000, and that money I offered to advance if I was allowed to retain the jewels as security. This was arranged between Mr. Carter and myself. But surely Mr. Carter does not refuse to carry out his engagement because the jewels has been stolen? He does. Why should he not? Then surely you will advance the 50,000 necessary? I will not. Why should I? Well, it seems to me, said I, with a slight laugh, the young man has very definitely checkmated both of you. He has, until I have laid him by the heels, which I am determined to do if he were the brother of 20 Lord Steffenhams. Please answer one more question. Are you determined to put the young man in prison, or would you be content with the return of the emeralds intact? Of course I should prefer to put him in prison and get the emeralds too, but if there's no choice in the matter, I must content myself with the necklace. Very well, my lord. I will undertake the case. This conference had detained us in the study till after 11, and then, as it was a clear, crisp December morning, I went out through the gardens into the park, that I might walk along the well-kept private road and meditate upon my course of action, or rather think over what had been said, because I could not map my route until I had heard the secret which the Lady Alicia promised to impart. As at present instructed, it seemed to me the best way to go direct to the young man, show him as effectively as I could the danger in which he stood, and if possible persuade him to deliver up the necklace to me. As I strolled along under the grand old leafless trees, I suddenly heard my name called impulsively 2 or 3 times, and, turning round, saw the Lady Alicia running towards me. Her cheeks were bright with nature's rouge, and her eyes sparkled more dazzlingly than any emerald that ever tempted man to wickedness. "Oh, Monsieur Valmont, I've been waiting for you, and you escaped me. Have you seen my uncle?" "Yes, I've been with him since 10 o'clock. "Well?" "Your ladyship, that is exactly the word with which he accosted me." "Ah, you see an additional likeness between my uncle and myself this morning, then." "Has he told you about Mr. Carter?" "Yes. So now you understand how important it is that I should regain possession of my property." "Yes," I said with a sigh, "the house near Hyde Park and the great estate in Derbyshire." She clapped her hands with glee, eyes and feet dancing in unison as she capered along gaily beside me, a sort of skippety-hop, sideways, keeping pace with my more stately step, as if she were a little girl of 6, instead of a young woman of 20. "Not only that," she cried, "but £1,000,000 to spend! Oh, Monsieur Valmont, you know Paris, and yet you do not seem to comprehend what that plethora of money means." "Well, madame, I have seen Paris, and I have seen a good deal of the world, but I am not so certain you will secure the £1,000,000 to spend." "What?" she cried, stopping short, that little wrinkle which betokened temper appearing on her brow. "Do you think we won't get the emeralds, then?" "Oh, I am sure we will get the emeralds. I, Valmont, pledge you my word. But if Mr. Jonas Carter before marriage calls a halt upon the ceremony until your uncle places £50,000 upon the table, I confess I am very pessimistic about your obtaining control of the £1,000,000 afterwards." All her vivacity instantaneously returned. "Pooh!" she cried, dancing round in front of me, and standing there directly in my path, so that I came to a stand. "Pooh!" she repeated, snapping her fingers, with an inimitable gesture of that lovely hand. "Monsieur Valmont, I am disappointed in you. You are not nearly so nice as you were last evening. It is very uncomplimentary in you to intimate that when once I am married to Mr. Jonas, I shall not wheedle from him all the money I want. Do not rest your eyes on the ground. Look at me and answer." I glanced up at her, and could not forbear laughing. The witchery of the wood was in that girl. Yes, and a perceptible trace of the Gallic devil flickered in those enchanting eyes of hers. I could not help myself. "Ah, Madame la Marquise de Bel-Air, how jauntily you would scatter despair in that susceptible court of Louis." "Ah, Monsieur Eugene de Valmont," she cried, mimicking my tones, and imitating my manner with an exactitude that amazed me. "You are once more my dear de Valmont of last night. I dreamed of you, I assure you I did, and now to find you in the morning, oh, so changed!" She clasped her little hands and inclined her head, while the sweet voice sank into a cadence of melancholy, which seemed so genuine that the mocking ripple of a laugh immediately following was almost a shock to me. Where had this creature of the dull English countryside learnt all such frou-frou of gesture and tone? "Have you ever seen Sarah Bernhardt?" I asked. Now the average Englishwoman would have inquired the genesis of so inconsequent a question, but Lady Alicia followed the trend of my thought, and answered at once as if my query had been quite expected. "Mais non, monsieur. Sarah the divine. Ah, she comes with my £1,000,000 a year and the house of Hyde Park. No, the only inhabitant of my real world whom I have yet seen is Monsieur Valmont, and he, alas, I find so changeable. But now, adieu frivolity, we must be serious," and she walked sedately by my side. "Do you know where you are going, monsieur? You are going to church. Oh, do not look frightened, not to a service. I am decorating the church with holly, and you shall help me and get thorns in your poor fingers." The private road, which up to this time had passed through a forest, now reached a secluded glade, in which stood a very small but exquisite church, evidently centuries older than the mansion we had left. Beyond it were grey stone ruins, which Lady Alicia pointed out to me as remnants of the original mansion that had been built in the reign of the second Henry. The church, it was thought, formed the private chapel to the hall, and it had been kept in repair by the various lords of the manor. "Now hearken to the power of the poor, and learn how they may flout the proud Marquis," cried Lady Alicia gleefully. "The poorest man in England may walk along this private road on Sunday to the church, and the proud Marquis is powerless to prevent him. Of course, if the poor man prolongs his walk, then he is in danger from the law of trespass. On weekdays, however, this is the most secluded spot on the estate, and I regret to say that my lordly uncle does not trouble it even on Sundays. I fear we are a degenerate race, Monsieur Valmont, for doubtless a fighting and deeply religious ancestor of mine built this church, and to think that when the useful masons cemented these stones together, Madame la Marquise de Bel-Air or Lady Alicia were alike unthought of, and though 300 years divide them, this ancient chapel makes them seem, as one might say, contemporaries. Oh, Monsieur Valmont, what is the use of worrying about emeralds or anything else? As I look at this beautiful old church, even the house of Hyde Park appears as naught. And to my amazement, the eyes that Lady Alicia turned upon me were wet. The front door was unlocked. We walked into the church in silence. Around the pillars holly and ivy were twined. Great armfuls of the shrubs had been flung here and there along the walls in heaps, and a step-ladder stood in one of the aisles, showing that the decoration of the edifice was not yet complete. A subdued melancholy had settled down on my erstwhile vivacious companion, the inevitable reaction so characteristic of the artistic temperament, augmented doubtless by the solemnity of the place, around whose walls in brass and marble were sculptured memorials of her ancient race. "You promised," I said at last, "to tell me how you came to suspect—" "Not here, not here," she whispered. Then rising from the pew in which she had seated herself, she said, "Let us go. I am in no mood for working this morning. I shall finish the decoration in the afternoon." We came out into the cool and brilliant sunlight again, and as we turned homeward, her spirits immediately began to rise. "I am anxious to know," I persisted, "why you came to suspect a man whom at first you believed innocent." "I am not sure but I believe him innocent now, although I am forced to the conclusion that he knows where the treasure is." "What forces you to that conclusion, my lady?" "A letter I received from himself, in which he makes a proposal so extraordinary that I am almost disinclined to accede to it, even though it leads to the discovery of my necklace. However, I am determined to leave no means untried, if I receive the support of my friend, Monsieur Valmont." "My lady," said I with a bow, "it is but yours to command, mine to obey." "What were the contents of that letter?" "Read it," she replied, taking the folded sheet from her pocket and handing it to me. She had been quite right in characterising the note as an extraordinary epistle. The Honourable John Haddon had the temerity to propose that she should go through a form of marriage with him in the old church we had just left. If she did that, he said, it would console him for the mad love he felt for her. The ceremony would have no binding force upon her whatever, and she might bring whom she pleased to perform it. If she knew no one that she could trust, he would invite an old college chum, and bring him to the church next morning at 7:30 o'clock. Even if an ordained clergyman performed the ceremony, it would not be legal unless it took place between the hours of 8 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. If she consented to this, the emeralds were hers once more. "This is the proposal of a madman," said I, as I handed back the letter. "Well," she replied, with a nonchalant shrug of her shoulders, "he has always said he was madly in love with me, and I quite believe it. Poor young man, if this mummery were to console him for the rest of his life, why should I not indulge him in it? Lady Alicia, surely you would not countenance the profaning of that lovely old edifice with a mock ceremonial? No man in his senses could suggest such a thing." Once more her eyes were twinkling with merriment. "But the Honourable John Haddon, as I have told you, is not in his senses." "Then why should you indulge him?" "Why? How can you ask such a question? Because of the emeralds. It is only a mad lark, after all, and no one need know of it. Oh, Monsieur Valmont," she cried pleadingly, clasping her hands, yet it seemed to me with an undercurrent of laughter in her beseeching tones, "will you not enact for us the part of clergyman? I am sure if your face were as serious as it is at this moment, the robes of a priest would become you. Lady Alicia, you are incorrigible. I am somewhat a man of the world, Yet I should not dare to counterfeit the sacred office, and I hope you but jest. In fact, I am sure you do, my lady." She turned away from me with a very pretty pout. "Monsieur Valmont, your knighthood is, after all, but surface deep. 'Tis not mine to command, and yours to obey. Certainly I did but jest. John shall bring his own imitation clergyman with him." "Are you going to meet him tomorrow?" "Certainly I am. I have promised. I must secure my necklace." "You seem to place great confidence in the belief that he will produce it." "If he fails to do so, then I play Monsieur Valmont as my trump card." "But, monsieur, although you quite rightly refuse to comply with my first request, you will surely not reject my second. Please meet me tomorrow at the head of the avenue promptly at 7:15, and escort me to the church." For a moment the negative trembled on my tongue's end, but she turned those enchanting eyes upon me, and I was undone. "Very well," I answered. She seized both my hands like a little girl overjoyed at a promised excursion. "Oh, Monsieur Valmont, you are a darling! I feel as if I'd known you all my life. I am sure you will never regret having humoured me." Then added a moment later, "If we get the emeralds." "Ah," said I, "if we get the emeralds." We were now within sight of the house, and she pointed out our rendezvous for the following day, and with that I bade her good-bye. It was shortly after 7 o'clock next morning when I reached the meeting-place. The Lady Alicia was somewhat long in coming, but when she arrived her face was aglow with girlish delight at the solemn prank she was about to play. "You have not changed your mind?" I asked, after the morning's greetings. "Oh, no, Monsieur Valmont," she replied with a bright laugh. "I am determined to recover those emeralds." "We must hurry, Lady Alicia, or we will be too late." "There's plenty of time," she remarked calmly, and she proved to be right, because when we came in sight of the church the clock pointed to the hour of 7:30. "Now," she said, "I shall wait here until you steal up to the church and look in through one of the windows that do not contain stained glass. I should not for the world arrive before Mr. Haddon and his friend are there." I did as requested, and saw two young men standing together in the centre aisle, one in the full robes of a clergyman, the other in his ordinary dress, whom I took to be the Honourable John Haddon. His profile was toward me, and I must admit there was very little of the madman in his calm countenance. His was a well-cut face, clean-shaven, and strikingly manly. In one of the pews was seated a woman. I learned afterwards she was Lady Alicia's maid, who had been instructed to come and go from the house by a footpath, while we had taken the longer road. I returned and escorted Lady Alicia to the church, and there was introduced to Mr. Haddon and his friend, the made-up divine. The ceremony was at once performed, and, man of the world as I profess myself to be, this enacting of private theatricals in a church grated upon me. When the maid and I were asked to sign the book as witnesses, I said, "Surely this is carrying realism a little too far." Mr. Haddon smiled, and replied, "I am amazed to hear a Frenchman objecting to realism going to its full length, and speaking for myself, I should be delighted to see the autograph of the renowned Eugene Valmont." And with that he proffered me the pen, whereupon I scrawled my signature. The maid had already signed and disappeared. The reputed clergyman bowed us out of the church, standing in the porch to see us walk up the avenue. "Ed," cried John Haddon, "I'll be back within half an hour, and will attend to the clock. You won't mind waiting?" "Not in the least, dear boy. God bless you both." And the tremor in his voice seemed to me carrying realism one step further still. The Lady Alicia, with downcast head, hurried us on until we were within the gloom of the forest, and then, ignoring me, she turned suddenly to the young man and placed her two hands on his shoulders. "Oh, Jack, Jack!" she cried. He kissed her twice on the lips. "Jack, Monsieur Valmont insists on the emeralds." The young man laughed. Her ladyship stood fronting him with her back towards me. Tenderly the young man unfastened something at the throat of that high-necked dress of hers. Then there was a snap, and he drew out an amazing, dazzling, shimmering sheen of green that seemed to turn the whole bleak December landscape verdant, as with a touch of spring. The girl hid her rosy face against him, and over her shoulder, with a smile, he handed me the celebrated Blair emeralds. "There is the treasure, Valmont," he cried, "on condition that you do not molest the culprit." "Or the accessory after the fact," gurgled Lady Alicia in smothered tones, with a hand clasping together her high-necked dress at the throat. "We trust to your invention, Valmont, to deliver that necklace to uncle, with a detective story that will thrill him to his very heart." We heard the clock strike 8. Then a second later, smaller bells chimed 1/4 past, and another second after they tinkled the half-hour. "Hullo!" cried Haddon, "Ed has attended to the clock himself. What a good fellow he is!" I looked at my watch. It was 25 minutes to 9. "Was the ceremony genuine, then?" I asked. "Ah, Valmont," said the young man, patting his wife affectionately on the shoulder, "nothing on earth can be more genuine than that ceremony was." And the volatile Lady Alicia snuggled closer to him. End of chapter 8.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chet Chris, London, UK. The Triumphs of Eugene Valmont, by Robert Barr. Chapter 9. The Adventures of Sherlaw Holmes. With apologies to Dr. Conan Doyle and his excellent book, A Study in Scarlet. I dropped in on my friend Sherlaw Holmes to hear what he had to say about the Pegram mystery, as it had come to be called in the newspapers. I found him playing the violin with a look of sweet peace and serenity on his face which I never noticed on the countenances of those within hearing distance. I knew this expression of seraphic calm indicated that Holmes had been deeply annoyed about something. Such indeed proved to be the case, for one of the morning papers had contained an article eulogizing the alertness and general competence of Scotland Yard. So great was Sherlaw Holmes's contempt for Scotland Yard that he never would visit Scotland during his vacations, nor would he ever admit that a Scotchman was fit for anything but export. He generously put away his violin, for he had a sincere liking for me, and greeted me with his usual kindness. "I've come," I began, plunging at once into the matter on my mind, "to hear what you think of the great Pegram mystery." "I haven't heard of it," he said quietly, just as if all London were not talking of that very thing. Holmes is curiously ignorant on some subjects, and abnormally learned on others. I found, for instance, that political discussion with him was impossible, because he did not know who Salisbury and Gladstone were. This made his friendship a great boon. "The Pegram mystery has baffled even Gregory of Scotland Yard." "I can well believe it," said my friend calmly. "Perpetual motion, or squaring the circle, would baffle Gregory. He's an infant, is Gregory." This was one of the things I always liked about Holmes. There was no professional jealousy in him, such as characterises so many other men. He filled his pipe, threw himself into his deep-seated arm-chair, placed his feet on the mantel, and clasped his hands behind his head. "Tell me about it," he said simply. "Old Barry Kipson," I began, "was a stockbroker in the city. He lived in Pegram, and it was his custom to—" "Come in," shouted Holmes, without changing his position, but with a suddenness that startled me. I had heard no knock. "Excuse me," said my friend, laughing.
My invitation to enter was a trifle premature. I was really so interested in your recital that I spoke before I thought, which a detective should never do. The fact is, a man will be here in a moment who will tell me all about this crime, and so you will be spared further effort in that line." "Ah, you have an appointment. In that case I will not intrude," I said, rising. "Sit down. I have no appointment. I did not know until I spoke that he was coming." I gazed at him in amazement. Accustomed as I was to his extraordinary talents, the man was a perpetual surprise to me. He continued to smoke quietly, but evidently enjoyed my consternation. "I see you are surprised. It is really too simple to talk about, but from my position opposite the mirror I can see the reflection of objects in the street." A man stopped, looked at one of my cards, and then glanced across the street. I recognised my card because, as you know, they are all in scarlet. If, as you say, London is talking of this mystery, it naturally follows that he will talk of it, and the chances are he wished to consult with me upon it. Anyone can see that. Besides, there is always— "Come in!" There was a rap at the door this time. A stranger entered. Sherlock Holmes did not change his lounging attitude. "I wish to see Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the detective," said the stranger, coming within the range of the smoker's vision. "This is Mr. Holmes," I remarked at last, as my friend smoked quietly and seemed half asleep. "Allow me to introduce myself," continued the stranger, fumbling for a card. "There is no need. You are a journalist," said Holmes. "Ah," said the stranger, somewhat taken aback. "You know me, then? Never saw or heard of you in my life before." "Then how in the world—" "Nothing simpler. You write for an evening paper. You have written an article slating the book of a friend. He will feel badly about it, and you will condole with him. He will never know who stabbed him unless I tell him." "The devil!" cried the journalist, sinking into a chair and mopping his brow, while his face became livid. "Yes," drawled Holmes. "It's a devil of a shame that such things are done, but what would you, as we say in France?" When the journalist had recovered his second wind, he pulled himself together somewhat. "Would you object to telling me how you know these particulars about a man you say you have never seen?" "I rarely talk about these things," said Holmes, with great composure, "but as the cultivation of the habit of observation may help you in your profession, and thus in a remote degree benefit me by making your paper less deadly dull, I will tell you. Your first and second fingers are smeared with ink, which shows that you write a great deal. This smeared class embraces two subclasses, clerks or accountants, and journalists. Clerks have to be neat in their work. The ink smear is slight in their case. Your fingers are badly and carelessly smeared, therefore you are a journalist. You have an evening paper in your pocket. Anyone might have any evening paper, but yours is a special edition, which will not be on the streets for half an hour yet. You must have obtained it before you left the office, and to do this you must be on the staff. A book notice is marked with a blue pencil. A journalist always despises every article in his own paper not written by himself. Therefore you wrote the article you have marked, and doubtless are about to send it to the author of the book referred to. Your paper makes a speciality of abusing all books not written by some member of its own staff. That the author is a friend of yours I merely surmised. It is all a trivial example of ordinary observation." "Really, Mr. Holmes, you are the most wonderful man on earth. You are the equal of Gregory, by Jove, you are." A frown marred the brow of my friend as he placed his pipe on the sideboard and drew his self-cocking six-shooter. "Do you mean to insult me, sir?" "I do not. I assure you. You are fit to take charge of Scotland Yard tomorrow. I am in earnest. Indeed I am, sir." "Then Heaven help you," cried Holmes, slowly raising his right arm. I sprang between them. "Don't shoot," I cried. "You'll spoil the carpet. Besides, Sherlaw, don't you see the man means well? He actually thinks it's a compliment." "Perhaps you are right," remarked the detective, flinging his revolver carelessly beside his pipe, much to the relief of the third party. Then, turning to the journalist, he said with his customary bland courtesy, "You wanted to see me, I think you said. What can I do for you, Mr. Wilbur Scribbings?" The journalist started. "How do you know my name?" he gasped. Holmes waved his hand impatiently. "Look inside your hat, if you doubt your own name." I then noticed for the first time that the name was plainly to be seen inside the top hat Scribbings held upside down in his hands. "You have heard, of course, of the Pegram mystery?" "Tush!" cried the detective. "Do not, I beg of you, call it a mystery. There is no such thing. Life would become more tolerable if there ever was a mystery. Nothing is original. Everything has been done before. What about the Pegram affair?" "The Pegram case has baffled everyone. The Evening Blade wishes you to investigate so that it may publish the result. It will pay you well. Will you accept the commission?" "Possibly. Tell me about the case." "I thought everybody knew the particulars. Mr. Barry Kipson lived at Pegram. He carried a first-class season ticket between the terminus and that station. It was his custom to leave for Pegram on the 5:30 train each evening. Some weeks ago Mr. Kipson was brought down by the influenza. On his first visit to the city after his recovery, he drew something like £300 in notes, and left the office at his usual hour to catch the 5:30. He was never seen again alive, as far as the public have been able to learn. He was found at Brewster in a first-class compartment on the Scotch Express, which does not stop between London and Brewster. There was a bullet in his head, and his money was gone, pointing plainly to murder and robbery." "And where is the mystery, might I ask?" "There are several unexplainable things about the case. First, how came he on the Scotch Express, which leaves at 6, and does not stop at Pegram? Second, the ticket examiners at the terminus would have turned him out if he showed his season ticket, and all the tickets sold for the Scotch Express on the 21st are accounted for. Third, how could the murderer have escaped? Fourth, the passengers in the two compartments on each side of the one where the body was found heard no scuffle and no shot fired. Are you sure the Scotch Express on the 21st did not stop between London and Brewster?" "Now that you mention the fact, it did. It was stopped by signal just outside of Pegram. There was a few moments' pause when the line was reported clear, and it went on again. This frequently happens, as there is a branch line beyond Pegram." Mr. Sherlock Holmes pondered for a few moments, smoking his pipe silently. "I presume you wish the solution in time for tomorrow's paper?" "Bless my soul, no. The editor thought if you evolved a theory in a month you would do well." "My dear sir, I do not deal with theories, but with facts. If you can make it convenient to call here tomorrow at 8 a.m., I will give you the full particulars early enough for the first edition. There is no sense in taking up much time over so simple an affair as the Pegram case. Good afternoon, sir." Mr. Scribbings was too much astonished to return the greeting. He left in a speechless condition, and I saw him go up the street with his hat still in his hand. Sherlock Holmes relapsed into his old lounging attitude, with his hands clasped behind his head. The smoke came from his lips in quick puffs at first, then at longer intervals. I saw he was coming to a conclusion, so I said nothing. Finally, he spoke in his most dreamy manner. "I do not wish to seem to be rushing things at all, Watson, but I am going out tonight on the Scotch Express. Would you care to accompany me?" "Bless me!" I cried, glancing at the clock. "You haven't time. It's after 5 now." "Ample time, Watson, ample," he murmured, without changing his position. "I give myself a minute and a half to change slippers and dressing gown for boots and coat, 3 seconds for hat, 25 seconds to the street, 42 seconds waiting for a hansom, and then 7 minutes at the terminus before the express starts. I shall be glad of your company." I was only too happy to have the privilege of going with him. It was most interesting to watch the workings of so inscrutable a mind. As we drove under the lofty iron roof of the terminus, I noticed a look of annoyance passed over his face. "We are 15 seconds ahead of our time," he remarked, looking at the big clock. "I dislike having a miscalculation of that sort occur." The great Scotch express stood ready for its long journey. The detective tapped one of the guards on the shoulder. "You have heard of the so-called Pegram mystery, I presume?" "Certainly, sir. It happened on this very train, sir." "Really? Is the same carriage still on the train?" "Well, yes, sir, it is," replied the guard, lowering his voice, "but of course, sir, we have to keep very quiet about it. People wouldn't travel in it else, sir." "Doubtless. Do you happen to know if anybody occupies the compartment in which the body was found?" "A lady and gentleman, sir. I put 'em in myself, sir." "Would you further oblige me," said the detective, deftly slipping half a sovereign into the hand of the guard, "by going to the window and informing them in an off-hand, casual sort of way that the tragedy took place in that compartment?" "Certainly, sir." We followed the guard, and the moment he had imparted his news there was a suppressed scream in the carriage. Instantly a lady came out, followed by a florid-faced gentleman, who scowled at the guard. We entered the now empty compartment, and Colmes said, "We would like to be alone here until we reach Brewster." "I'll see to that, sir," answered the guard, locking the door. When the official moved away, I asked my friend what he expected to find in the carriage that would cast any light on the case. "Nothing," was his brief reply. "Then why do you come?" "Merely to corroborate the conclusions I have already arrived at." "And might I ask what those conclusions are?" "Certainly," replied the detective, with a touch of lassitude in his voice. "I beg to call your attention, first, to the fact that this train stands between two platforms, and can be entered from either side. Any man familiar with the station for years would be aware of that fact. This shows how Mr. Kipson entered the train just before it started." "But the door on this side is locked," I objected, trying it. "Of course, but every season ticket holder carries a key. This accounts for the guard not seeing him, and for the absence of a ticket. Now let me give you some information about the influenza. The patient's temperature rises several degrees above normal, and he has a fever. When the malady has run its course, the temperature falls to 3/4 of a degree below normal. These facts are unknown to you, I imagine, because you are a doctor." I admitted such was the case. "Well, the consequence of this fall in temperature is that the convalescent's mind turns towards thoughts of suicide. Then is the time he should be watched by his friends. Then was the time Mr. Barry Kipson's friends did not watch him. You remember the 21st, of course? No? It was a most depressing day, fog all round and mud underfoot. Very good. He resolves on suicide. He wishes to be unidentified if possible, but forgets his season ticket. My experience is that a man about to commit a crime always forgets something. But how do you account for the disappearance of the money? The money has nothing to do with the matter. If he was a deep man and knew the stupidness of Scotland Yard, he probably sent the notes to an enemy. If not, they may have been given to a friend. Nothing is more calculated to prepare the mind for self-destruction than the prospect of a night ride on the Scotch express, and the view from the windows of the train as it passes through the northern part of London is particularly conducive to thoughts of annihilation. What became of the weapon? That is just the point on which I wish to satisfy myself. Excuse me for a moment." Mr. Sherlock Holmes drew down the window on the right-hand side, and examined the top of the casing minutely with a magnifying glass. Presently he heaved a sigh of relief, and drew up the sash. "Just as I expected," he remarked, speaking more to himself than to me. "There is a slight dent on the top of the window frame. It is of such a nature as to be made only by the trigger of a pistol falling from the nerveless hand of a suicide. He intended to throw the weapon far out of the window, but had not the strength. It might have fallen into the carriage. As a matter of fact, it bounced away from the line, and lies among the grass about 10 feet 6 inches from the outside rail." The only question that now remains is where the deed was committed, and the exact present position of the pistol reckoned in miles from London, but that, fortunately, is too simple to even need explanation. "Great heavens, Sherlaw!" I cried. "How can you call that simple? Seems to me impossible to compute." We were now flying over northern London, and the great detective leaned back with every sign of ennui, closing his eyes. At last he spoke wearily. "It is really too elementary, Watson, but I am always willing to oblige a friend. I shall be relieved, however, when you are able to work out the ABC of detection for yourself, although I shall never object to helping you with the words of more than 3 syllables. Having made up his mind to commit suicide, Kipson naturally intended to do it before he reached Brewster, because tickets are again examined at that point. When the train began to stop at the signal near Pegram, he came to the false conclusion that it was stopping at Brewster. The fact that the shot was not heard is accounted for by the screech of the air brake added to the noise of the train. Probably the whistle was also sounding at the same moment. The train, being a fast express, would stop as near the signal as possible. The air brake will stop a train in twice its own length. Call it 3 times in this case. Very well. At 3 times the length of this train from the signal post towards London, deducting half the length of the train, as this carriage is in the middle, you will find the pistol." "Wonderful!" I exclaimed. "Commonplace," he murmured. At this moment the whistle sounded shrilly, and we felt the grind of the air brakes. "The Pegram signal again," cried Colmes, with something almost like enthusiasm. "This is indeed luck. We will get out here, Watson, and test the matter." As the train stopped, we got out on the right-hand side of the line. The engine stood panting impatiently under the red light, which changed to green as I looked at it. As the train moved on with increasing speed, the detective counted the carriages and noted down the number. It was now dark, with the thin crescent of the moon hanging in the western sky, throwing a weird half-light on the shining metals. The rear lamps of the train disappeared around a curve, and the signal stood at baleful red again. The black magic of the lonesome night in that strange place impressed me, but the detective was a most practical man. He placed his back against the signal post and paced up the line with even strides, counting his steps. I walked along the permanent way beside him silently. At last he stopped and took a tape line from his pocket. He ran it out until the 10 feet 6 inches were unrolled, scanning the figures in the wan light of the new moon. Giving me the end, he placed his knuckles on the metals, motioning me to proceed down the embankment. I stretched out the line and then sank my hand in the damp grass to mark the spot. "Good God!" I cried aghast. "What's this?" "It is the pistol," said Colmes quietly. It was. Journalistic London will not soon forget the sensation that was caused by the record of the investigations of Sherlock Holmes, as printed at length in the next day's Evening Blade. Would that my story ended here. Alas! Colmes contemptuously turned over the pistol to Scotland Yard. The meddlesome officials, actuated as I always hold by jealousy, found the name of the seller upon it. They investigated. The seller testified that it had never been in the possession of Mr. Kipson as far as he knew. It was sold to a man whose description tallied with that of a criminal long watched by the police. He was arrested, and turned Queen's evidence in the hope of hanging his pal. It seemed that Mr. Kipson, who was a gloomy, taciturn man, and usually came home in a compartment by himself, thus escaping observation, had been murdered in the lane leading to his house. After robbing him, the miscreants turned their thoughts toward the disposal of the body, a subject that always occupies a first-class criminal mind before the deed is done. They agreed to place it on the line and have it mangled by the Scotch express, then nearly due. Before they got the body halfway up the embankment, the express came along and stopped. The guard got out and walked along the other side to speak with the engineer. The thought of putting the body into an empty first-class carriage instantly occurred to the murderers. They opened the door with the deceased's key. It is supposed that the pistol dropped when they were hoisting the body in the carriage. The Queen's evidence dodge didn't work, and Scotland Yard ignobly insulted my friend Sherlock Holmes by sending him a pass to see the villains hanged. End of chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Czech Chris, London, UK. The Triumphs of Eugene Valmont, by Robert Barr. Chapter 10. The Adventure of the Second Swag. The time was Christmas Eve, 1904. The place was an ancient, secluded manor house, built so far back in the last century as 1896. It stood at the head of a profound valley, a valley clothed in ferns waist deep and sombrely guarded by ancient trees, the remnants of a primeval forest. From this mansion no other human habitation could be seen. The descending road which connected the King's Highway with the stronghold was so sinuous and precipitate that more than once the grim baronet who owned it had upset his automobile in trying to negotiate the dangerous curves. The isolated situation and gloomy architecture of this venerable mansion must have impressed the most casual observer with the thought that here was the spot for the perpetration of dark deeds, were it not for the fact that the place was brilliantly illumined with electricity, while the silence was emphasized rather than disturbed by the monotonous regular thud of an accumulator pumping the subtle fluid into a receptive dynamo situated in an outhouse to the east. The night was gloomy and lowering after a day of rain, but the very sombreness of the scene made the brilliant stained-glassed windows stand out like the radiant covers of a Christmas number. Such was the appearance presented by Undershaw, the home of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, situated among the wilds of Hindhead, some 40 or 50 miles from London. Is it any wonder that, at a spot so remote from civilization, law should be set at defiance, and that the one lone policeman who perambulates the district should tremble as he passed the sinister gates of Undershaw? In a large room of this manor house, furnished with a luxuriant elegance one would not have expected in a region so far from humanizing influences, sat two men. One was a giant in stature, whose broad brow and smoothly shaven strong chin gave a look of determination to his countenance, which was further enhanced by the heavy black moustache which covered his upper lip. There was something of the dragoon in his upright and independent bearing. He had, in fact, taken part in more than one fiercely fought battle, and was a member of several military clubs, but it was plain to be seen that his ancestors had used war clubs, and had transmitted to him the physique of a Hercules. One did not need to glance at the Christmas number of the Strand, which he held in his hand, nor read the name printed there in large letters, to know that he was face to face with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. His guest, an older man, yet still in the prime of life, whose beard was tinged with grey, was of less warlike bearing than the celebrated novelist, belonging, as he evidently did, to the civil and not the military section of life. He had about him the air of a prosperous man of affairs, shrewd, good-natured, conciliatory, and these two strongly contrasting personages are types of the men to whom England owes her greatness. The reader of the Christmas number will very probably feel disappointed when he finds, as he supposes, merely two old friends sitting amicably in a country house after dinner. There seems, to his jaded taste, no element of tragedy in such a situation. These two men appear comfortable enough, and respectable enough. It is true that there is whisky and soda at hand, and the box of cigars is open, yet there are latent possibilities of passion under the most placid natures, revealed only to writers of fiction in our halfpenny press. Let the reader wait, therefore, till he sees these two men tried as by fire under a great temptation, and then let him say whether even the probity of Sir George Newnes comes scatheless from the ordeal. "Have you brought the swag, Sir George?" asked the novelist, with some trace of anxiety in his voice. "Yes," replied the great publisher, "but before proceeding to the count, would it not be wise to give orders that will ensure our being left undisturbed?" "You are right," replied Doyle, pressing an electric button. When the servant appeared, he said, "I am not at home to anyone. No matter who calls or what excuse is given, you must permit none to approach this room." When the servant had withdrawn, Doyle took the further precaution of thrusting in place one of the huge bolts which ornamented the massive oaken door, studded with iron knobs. Sir George withdrew from the tail pocket of his dress coat 2 canvas bags, and, untying the strings, poured the rich red gold on the smooth table. "I think you will find that right," he said. £6,000 in all." The writer dragged his heavy chair nearer the table and began to count the coins 2 by 2, withdrawing each pair from the pile with his extended forefingers in the manner of one accustomed to deal with great treasure. For a time the silence was unbroken, save by the chink of gold, when suddenly a high-keyed voice outside penetrated even the stout oak of the huge door. The shrill exclamation seemed to touch a chord of remembrance in the mind of Sir George Newnes. Nervously he grasped the arms of his chair, sitting very bolt upright, muttering, "Can it be he, of all persons, at this time of all times?" Doyle glanced up with an expression of annoyance on his face, murmuring, to keep his memory green, 110, 110, 110. "Not at home!" cried the vibrant voice. "Nonsense! Everybody is at home on Christmas Eve." "You don't seem to be," he heard the servant reply. "Me? Oh, I have no home. Merely rooms in Baker Street. I must see your master, and at once." "Master left in his motor car half an hour ago to attend the county ball given tonight at the Royal Huts Hotel, 7 miles away," answered the servant, with that glib mastery of fiction which unconsciously comes to those who are members, even in a humble capacity, of a household devoted to the production of imaginative art. "Nonsense, I say again," came the strident voice. "It is true that the tracks of an automobile are on the ground in front of your door, but if you will notice the markings of the puncture-proof belt, you will see that the automobile is returning and not departing. It went to the station before the last shower to bring back a visitor, and since its arrival there has been no rain. That suit of armour in the hall, spattered with mud, shows it to be the casing the visitor wore. The blazonry upon it of a pair of scissors above an open book resting upon a printing press indicates that the wearer is first of all an editor, second a publisher, and third a printer. The only baronet in England whose occupation corresponds with this heraldic device is Sir George Newnes." "You forget Sir Alfred Harmsworth," said the servant, whose hand held a copy of Answers. If the insistent visitor was taken aback by this unlooked-for rejoinder, his manner showed no trace of embarrassment, and he went on unabashed. "As the last shower began at 10 minutes to 6, Sir George must have arrived at Haslemere Station on the 6:19 from Waterloo. He has had dinner, and at this moment is sitting comfortably with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, doubtless in the front room, which I see is so brilliantly lighted. Now, if you will kindly take in my card—" "But I tell you," persisted the perplexed servant, "that the master left in his motor car for the county ball at the Royal—" "Oh, I know. There stands his suit of armour too, newly black-leaded, whose coat of arms is a couchant typewriter on an automobile rampant." "Great heavens!" cried Sir George, his eyes brightening with the light of unholy desire. "You have material enough there, Doyle, for a story in our January number. What do you say?" A deep frown marred the smoothness of the novelist's brow. "I say," he replied sternly, "that this man has been sending threatening letters to me. I have had enough of his menaces." "Then triply bolt the door," advised Newnes, with a sigh of disappointment, leaning back in his chair. "Do you take me for a man who bolts when his enemy appears?" asked Doyle fiercely, rising to his feet. "No, I will unbolt. He shall meet the Douglas in his hall." "Better have him in the drawing-room where it's warm," suggested Sir George with a smile, diplomatically desiring to pour oil on the troubled waters. The novelist, without reply, spread a copy of that evening's Westminster Gazette over the pile of gold, strode to the door and threw it open, and said coldly, "Show the gentleman in, please." There entered to them a tall, self-possessed, calm man, with clean-shaven face, eagle eye, and inquisitive nose. Although the visit was most embarrassing at that particular juncture, the natural courtesy of the novelist restrained him from giving utterance to his resentment of the intrusion, and he proceeded to introduce the bidden to the unbidden guest, as if each were equally welcome. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, permit me to present to you Sir George—" "It is quite superfluous," said the newcomer, in an even voice of exasperating tenor, "for I perceive at once that one who wears a green waistcoat must be a Liberal of strong Home Rule opinions, or the editor of several publications wearing covers of emerald hue. The shamrock necktie, in addition to the waistcoat, indicates that the gentleman before me is both, and so I take it for granted that this is Sir George Newnes. How is your circulation, Sir George?" "Rapidly rising," replied the editor. "I am glad of that," asserted the intruder suavely, "and can assure you that the temperature outside is as rapidly falling." The great detective spread his hands before the glowing electric fire, and rubbed them vigorously together. "I perceive through that evening paper the sum of £6,000 in gold." Doyle interrupted him with some impatience. "You didn't see it through the paper, you saw it in the paper. Goodness knows it's been mentioned in enough of the sheets." "As I was about to remark," went on Sherlock Holmes imperturbably, "I am amazed that a man whose time is so valuable should waste it in counting the money. You are surely aware that a golden sovereign weighs 123.44 grains. Therefore, if I were you, I should have up the kitchen scales, dump in the metal, and figure out the amount with a lead pencil. You brought the gold in 2 canvas bags, did you not, Sir George?" "In the name of all that's wonderful, how do you know that?" asked the astonished publisher. Sherlock Holmes, with a superior smile, casually waved his hand toward the 2 bags which still lay on the polished table. "Oh, I'm tired of this sort of thing," said Doyle wearily, sitting down in the first chair that presented itself. "Can't you be honest even on Christmas Eve? You know the oracles of old did not try it on with each other." "That is true," said Sherlock Holmes. "The fact is, I followed Sir George Newnes into the Capital and Counties Bank this afternoon, where he demanded £6,000 in gold, but when he learned that this would weigh 96 pounds 7 ounces avoirdupois weight, and that even troy weight would make the sum no lighter, he took 2 small bags of gold and the rest in Bank of England notes. I came from London on the same train with him, but he was off in the automobile before I could make myself known, and so I had to walk up. I was further delayed by taking the wrong turning on the top and finding myself at that charming spot in the neighbourhood where a sailor was murdered by 2 ruffians a century or so ago." There was a note of warning in Doyle's voice when he said, "Did that incident teach you no lesson? Did you not realise that you were in a dangerous locality?" "And likely to fall in with 2 ruffians?" asked Holmes, slightly elevating his eyebrows, while the same sweet smile hovered round his thin lips. "No, the remembrance of the incident encouraged me. It was the man who had the money that was murdered. I brought no coin with me, although I expect to bear many away. Would you mind telling us, without further circumlocution, what brings you here so late at night?" Sherlock Holmes heaved a sigh, and mournfully shook his head very slowly. "After all the teaching I have bestowed upon you, Doyle, is it possible that you cannot deduct even so simple a thing as that? Why am I here? Because Sir George made a mistake about those bags. He was quite right in taking one of them to Undershaw, but he should have left the other at 221B Baker Street. I call this little trip the adventure of the second swag. Here is the second swag on the table. The first swag you received long ago, and all I had for my share was some honeyed words of compliment in the stories you wrote. Now it is truly said that soft words butter no parsnips, and in this instance they do not even turn away wrath. So far as the second swag is concerned, I have come to demand half of it." "I am not so poor at deduction as you seem to imagine," said Doyle, apparently nettled at the other's slighting reference to his powers. "I was well aware when you came in what your errand was. I deduced further that if you saw Sir George withdraw gold from the bank, you also followed him to Waterloo Station." "Quite right. When he purchased his ticket for Haslemere, you did the same." "I did." "When you arrived at Haslemere, you sent a telegram to your friend, Dr. Watson, telling him of your whereabouts." "You are wrong there. I ran after the motor car." "You certainly sent a telegram from somewhere to someone, or at least dropped a note in the post box. There are signs, which I need not mention, that point irrevocably to such a conclusion." The doomed man, ruined by his own self-complacency, merely smiled in his superior manner, not noticing the eager look with which Doyle awaited his answer. "Wrong entirely. I neither wrote any telegram nor spoke any message since I left London." "Ah, no," cried Doyle. "I see where I went astray. You merely inquired the way to my house." "I needed to make no inquiries. I followed the rear light of the automobile part way up the hill, and when that disappeared, I turned to the right instead of the left, as there was no one out on such a night from whom I could make inquiry." "My deductions, then, are beside the mark," said Doyle hoarsely, in an accent which sent cold chills up and down the spine of his invited guest, but conveyed no intimation of his fate to the self-satisfied later arrival. "Of course they were," said Holmes, with exasperating self-assurance. "Am I also wrong in deducting that you have had nothing to eat since you left London?" "No, you are quite right there." "Well, oblige me by pressing that electric button." Holmes did so with much eagerness, but although the trio waited some minutes in silence, there was no response. "I deduct from that," said Doyle, "that the servants have gone to bed. After I have quite satisfied all your claims in the way of hunger for food and gold, I shall take you back in my motor car, unless you prefer to stay here the night." "You are very kind," said Sherlock Holmes. "Not at all," replied Doyle. "Just take that chair, draw it up to the table, and we will divide the second swag." The chair indicated differed from all the others in the room. It was straight-backed, and its oaken arms were covered by two plates, apparently of German silver. When Holmes clutched it by the arms to drag it forward, he gave one half-articulate gasp and plunged headlong to the floor, quivering. Sir George Newnes sprang up standing with a cry of alarm. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle remained seated, a seraphic smile of infinite satisfaction playing about his lips. "Has he fainted?" cried Sir George. "No, merely electrocuted. A simple device the Sheriff of New York taught me when I was over there last." "Merciful heavens! Cannot he be resuscitated?" "My dear Newnes," said Doyle, with the air of one from whose shoulders a great weight is lifted, "a man may fall into the chasm at the foot of the Reichenbach Fall and escape to record his adventures later, but when 2,000 volts pass through the human frame, the person who owns that frame is dead." "You don't mean to say you've murdered him?" asked Sir George in an awed whisper. "Well, the term you use is harsh. Still, it rather accurately sums up the situation. To speak candidly, Sir George, I don't think they can indict us for anything more than manslaughter. You see, this is a little invention for the reception of burglars. Every night before the servants go to bed, they switch on the current to this chair. That's why I asked Holmes to press the button. I place a small table beside the chair, and put on it a bottle of wine, whisky and soda, and cigars. Then if any burglar comes in, he invariably sits down in the chair to enjoy himself, and so you see that piece of furniture is an effective method of reducing crime. The number of burglars I have turned over to the parish to be buried will prove that this taking off of Holmes was not premeditated by me. This incident strictly speaking, is not murder, but manslaughter. We shouldn't get more than 14 years apiece, and probably that would be cut down to 7 on the ground that we had performed an act for the public benefit." "Apiece!" cried Sir George. "But what have I had to do with it?" "Everything, my dear sir, everything. As that babbling fool talked, I saw in your eye the gleam which betokens avarice for copy. Indeed, I think you mentioned the January number. You were therefore accessory before the fact. I simply had to slaughter the poor wretch." Sir George sank back in his chair, well nigh breathless with horror. Publishers are humane men who rarely commit crimes. Authors, however, are a hardened set, who usually perpetrate a felony every time they issue a book. Doyle laughed easily. "I'm used to this sort of thing," he said. "Remember how I killed off the people in the White Company? Now, if you will help me to get rid of the body, all may yet be well. You see, I learned from the misguided simpleton himself that nobody knows where he is today. He often disappears for weeks at a time, so there really is slight danger of detection. Will you lend a hand?" "I suppose I must," cried the conscience-stricken man. Doyle at once threw off the lassitude which the coming of Sherlock Holmes had caused, and acted now with an energy which was characteristic of him. Going to an outhouse, he brought the motor car to the front door, then, picking up Holmes and followed by his trembling guest, he went outside and flung the body into the tonneau behind. He then threw a spade and a pick into the car and covered everything up with a waterproof spread. Lighting the lamps, he bade his silent guest get up beside him, and so they started on their fateful journey, taking the road past the spot where the sailor had been murdered, and dashing down the long hill at fearful speed toward London. "Why do you take this direction?" asked Sir George. "Wouldn't it be more advisable to go further into the country?" Doyle laughed harshly. "Haven't you a place on Wimbledon Common? Why not bury him in your garden?" "Merciful motors!" cried the horrified man. "How can you propose such a thing? Talking of gardens, why not have buried him in your own, which was infinitely safer than going forward at this pace?" "Have no fear," said Doyle reassuringly. "We shall find him a suitable sepulchre without disturbing either of our gardens. I'll be in the centre of London within 2 hours." Sir George stared in affright at the demon driver. The man had evidently gone mad. To London, of all places in the world! Surely that was the one spot on earth to avoid. "Stop the motor and let me off," he cried. "I'm going to wake up the nearest magistrate and confess." "You'll do nothing of the sort," said Doyle. "Don't you see that no person on earth would suspect 2 criminals of making for London when they have the whole country before them? Haven't you read my stories? The moment a man commits a crime, he tries to get as far from London as possible. Every policeman knows that. Therefore 2 men coming into London are innocent strangers, according to Scotland Yard. But then we may be taken up for fast driving, and think of the terrible burden we carry. We're safe on the country roads, and I'll slow down when we reach the suburbs." It was approaching 3 o'clock in the morning when a huge motor car turned out of Trafalgar Square and went eastward along the Strand. The northern side of the Strand was up, as it usually is, and the motor, skilfully driven, glided past the piles of wood paving blocks, great sombre kettles holding tar, and the general débris of a repaving convulsion. Opposite Southampton Street, at the very spot so graphically illustrated by George C. Haight on the cover of the Strand magazine, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle stopped his motor. The Strand was deserted. He threw pick and shovel into the excavation and curtly ordered his companion to take his choice of weapons. Sir George selected the pick, and Doyle vigorously plied the spade. In almost less time than it takes to tell it, a very respectable hole had been dug, and in it was placed the body of the popular private detective. Just as the last spadeful was shovelled in place, the stern voice of a policeman awoke the silence and caused Sir George to drop his pick from nerveless hands. "What are you 2 doing down there?" "That's all right, officer," said Doyle glibly, as one who had foreseen every emergency. "My friend here is controller of the Strand. When the Strand is up, he's responsible, and it has the largest circulation it's up oftener than any other street in the world. We cannot inspect the work satisfactorily while traffic is on, and so we've been examining it in the night time. I'm his secretary. I do the writing, you know." "Oh, I see," replied the constable. "Well, gentlemen, good morning to you, and Merry Christmas." "The same to you, constable. Just lend a hand, will you?" The officer of the law helped each of the men up to the level of the road. As Doyle drove away from the ill-omened spot, he said, "Thus we have disposed of poor Holmes in the busiest spot on earth, where no one will ever think of looking for him, and we've put him away without even a Christmas box round him. We've buried him for ever in the Strand." End of chapter 10. End of the Triumphs of Eugene Valmont.